There is a family you have almost certainly never heard of. They appear in only one chapter of the entire Bible. They hold no armies, no palaces, no thrones. They perform no miracles. They conquer no kingdoms. They are not royalty, not priests, not prophets. They are a clan of wanderers who live in tents, drink no wine and plant no crops. And yet, in one of the most turbulent moments in the history of the ancient world, God points to them, a quiet, ordinary family, and says to an entire nation, "Look at them, learn from them. They understood something that you never could." This is the story of the Rechabites. It is a story about obedience, about legacy, about what happens when a single ancestor makes a decision so profound that it echoes through generations long after that ancestor is dust and memory. It is a story about a world spinning toward collapse, about empires swallowing kingdoms whole, about a people who abandoned their God while that God watched, heartbroken from the heights of history. And in the middle of all of that ruin, in the middle of the fire, there is one family standing still, unmoved, faithful, uncompromising. They are not famous. They are not celebrated in stained glass or hymns, but heaven noticed them. And that, as you will discover, is the only kind of recognition that lasts. Settle in. Let the night grow quiet around you. Because this story does not begin with thunder or miracles. It begins with a simple invitation, in a room inside the temple, with a table set with wine, and with a family that looked at that table and said no. The world in crisis. Chapter 1. To understand the Rechabites, you must first understand the world they lived in, because their obedience was not tested in easy times. It was tested in one of the most dangerous, disorienting, and morally exhausted periods in the history of ancient Judah. Their faithfulness did not grow in peaceful soil. It was forged in the middle of an empire's shadow, inside a nation that had largely forgotten what it meant to honour God. The year is somewhere around 600 years before the birth of Christ. The southern kingdom of Judah, the smaller surviving fragment of what was once the United Kingdom of Israel, is caught in a vice between two grinding powers, Egypt to the southwest, Babylon to the northeast. The great empire of Nebuchadnezzar is rising like a tide that has no intention of stopping, sweeping across the ancient Near East with terrifying efficiency, absorbing kingdom after kingdom into its vast administrative machine. Smaller nations face a brutal calculation: submit and survive, or resist and be destroyed. Judah is attempting to navigate this impossible geography with whatever resources it has left, which are not many. Decades of poor leadership, spiritual compromise, and political corruption have hollowed out the nation from the inside. The kingdom that once stretched from the borders of Egypt to the banks of the Euphrates under Solomon's reign is now a diminished, anxious territory clustered around its capital, Jerusalem, trying to remember what it once was while struggling to simply endure. King Jehoiakim sits on the throne during the events of Jeremiah 35. He is not remembered fondly by history. The prophet Jeremiah, who will live to see Jerusalem fall, describes his reign as a period of profound injustice and spiritual abandonment. Jehoiakim is a man who burns Jeremiah's scroll rather than hear its warnings. He builds expensive additions to his palace using forced labour while his people suffer. He collects taxes to pay tribute to Egypt, squeezing the poor to fund relationships with foreign powers. He is precisely the kind of leader who arrives when a nation has already decided that comfort matters more than integrity. Under Jehoiakim's reign, the spiritual landscape of Judah has become something its founding ancestors would not recognise. The worship of foreign gods is not hidden or shameful. It has become embedded in the daily life of the nation. Altars to Baal stand in the high places outside the cities. Asherah poles are planted throughout the land. The temple in Jerusalem, the house of God that Solomon built, the structure that took 7 years to complete and represented the heart of Israel's covenant identity, has become one place of worship among many rather than the only place. Idolatry has not conquered Judah all at once. It has done what it always does. It has crept in gradually, normalised slowly, accommodated incrementally, until the lines between faithfulness and compromise no longer look like lines at all. This is the world that Jeremiah is called to speak into. And Jeremiah is not a comfortable prophet. He is one of the most emotionally raw, spiritually transparent figures in all of Scripture. A man who weeps over the very people he rebukes, who argues with God in the darkness of his despair, who carries the weight of a message that almost no one wants to hear. He has been preaching for decades by the time of Jeremiah 35. He has warned. He has begged. He has described in language of extraordinary grief and beauty what the nation is walking toward if it does not turn. And Judah has largely ignored him. Into this context, this story of national abandonment, political desperation, and spiritual exhaustion, God does something unexpected. He does not send another warning. He does not commission another sermon. He does not call Jeremiah to the city gates to cry out once more into the indifferent noise of Jerusalem. He tells Jeremiah to invite a family to dinner. Not a wealthy family, not a priestly family, not a family that anyone in the royal court would have recognized or respected. A clan of wanderers who live in tents, people who are, in the language of their culture, deliberately keeping themselves on the margins, not because they are poor, but because they have chosen simplicity as a spiritual discipline. People who have been following a set of ancestral instructions for so long that the instructions themselves have become part of who they are. Go to the house of the Rechabites, God tells Jeremiah, and bring them to the temple and offer them wine. It is an unusual assignment, and as you're about to discover, it is an assignment with extraordinary purpose. Who were the Rechabites? Chapter 2. Before we can understand what happens in the temple, we need to spend some time with this family, to understand where they came from, what they believed, and why they lived the way they did. Because the Rechabites are not simply a clan of people who happen to abstain from wine, they are the living embodiment of a decision made by one man in one moment that shaped an entire lineage for generations. The Rechabites are named after their ancestor Rechab, but the specific figure who gave them their defining instructions was his son Jonadab, also called Jehonadab in some texts. Jonadab, son of Rechab, is not a major character in the biblical narrative, but he appears briefly in an earlier story that tells you everything you need to know about his convictions. In 2 Kings chapter 10, Jonadab encounters the warrior king Jehu, who is riding toward the city of Samaria to carry out judgment against the house of Ahab and the prophets of Baal. Jehu sees Jonadab on the road and stops. He asks him, "Is your heart right, as my heart is with your heart?" And Jonadab says yes. Jehu pulls him up into his chariot. The two of them ride together towards Samaria. This is a brief cameo, but it reveals something important about Jonadab. He's a man of strong convictions and clear alliances. He's not a man who tries to stay neutral. He aligns himself with the pursuit of righteousness even when that pursuit is costly and controversial. He climbs into the chariot of a man carrying out bloody radical reform because he believes in what that man is doing. Jonadab is someone who, when he sees a line, crosses it deliberately and without apology. This same character, the character of the man who takes clear positions, who honours his convictions with action, eventually expresses itself in a set of instructions that Jonadab gives to his children. We do not know exactly when these instructions were given or under what circumstances. The biblical text does not elaborate on the moment of their origin. But by the time of Jeremiah 35, which is likely more than 200 years after Jonadab's time, these instructions are still being followed, precisely, completely, without modification. The instructions were specific and demanding. Jonadab told his descendants, "You shall drink no wine, neither you nor your sons forever. You shall not build a house. You shall not sow seed. You shall not plant or have a vineyard. You shall dwell in tents all your days, so that you may live many days in the land where you sojourn." Read those instructions slowly, because each one of them is deliberate. No wine. Wine in the ancient Near East was not simply a beverage. It was embedded in culture, in celebration, in hospitality, in commerce, in religious ritual. Wine was everywhere. To abstain from wine was to constantly distinguish yourself from the culture around you, to mark yourself as different in the most ordinary social situations, at meals, at festivals, at gatherings. Every time someone offered the Rechabites a cup and they declined, they were making a statement. Not a loud statement, not an aggressive one, just a quiet, consistent declaration. We are not governed by the customs of the world around us. We are governed by something else. No permanent houses. This instruction is extraordinary when you consider what it means over time. Every human being across the centuries has known the pull toward permanence, toward building something that says, I was here, I belong here. This land is mine. Houses represent security. They represent investment. They represent the belief that the future is worth preparing for. To refuse to build a permanent house is to refuse to plant yourself in the world. It is to remain always in the posture of a sojourner, someone passing through, someone whose ultimate home is not made of stone and timber. No planting, no vineyards. Agriculture was the foundation of ancient economy. To not plant is to be deliberately dependent on God, on movement, on the provision that comes from a life that cannot be entirely controlled. The Rechabites could not hoard. They could not accumulate in the way that farmers accumulate. They had to live with a kind of structural trust built into their existence. Tents, always tents, not as poverty, but as philosophy. The tent is the symbol of the pilgrim. It is the dwelling of someone who knows that this is not their final destination. The Israelites wandered through the wilderness in tents. The Ark of God was kept in a tent, the tabernacle, before the temple was built. To live in a tent is to identify yourself with a particular kind of spiritual posture, mobile, unattached, dependent, temporary. Now hold all of that in your mind and then consider the most remarkable thing about these instructions. They were not given by God. They were given by a man. Jonadab, son of Rechab, was not a prophet. He was not a priest. He was not a king. He was a man who saw something, who saw where his world was heading perhaps, or who understood something deep about the corrupting effects of comfort and accumulation and settled ease. And he made a decision. He said to his children, this is how we will live. Not because the law requires it, not because a prophet commanded it, because I have seen what happens to people who drink too deeply from the cup of this world, and I want something different for you. And his children obeyed, and their children obeyed, and their children's children obeyed, for more than 200 years across the full sweep of Judah's history, through the reigns of good kings and bad ones, through periods of national renewal and national collapse, through times when the culture pressed in on every side, the Rechabites kept Jonadab's instructions. They were not alone when the events of Jeremiah 35 begin. The text mentions that the whole house of the Rechabites had come to Jerusalem to escape the advancing armies of Babylon and the allied forces of the Chaldeans and Arameans who were devastating the countryside. This detail is quietly important. The Rechabites, who lived in tents and moved freely through the land, had been forced by the violent chaos of their times to shelter inside a walled city. They are technically violating the spirit of their nomadic calling by being inside Jerusalem's walls, but not by choice. They are refugees within the city, waiting for the danger to pass so they can return to their wandering life. This is the family that Jeremiah is asked to invite into the temple. Jeremiah's strange assignment. Chapter 3. Picture the temple in Jerusalem, not as it exists today, for it does not exist today, having been destroyed by Babylon less than 2 decades after the events of Jeremiah 35, but as it stood then in the late reign of Jehoiakim, the great structure of limestone and cedar that Solomon built and that had been the spiritual centre of Israelite life for centuries. The outer courts, where ordinary people came to offer sacrifices and prayers. The inner courts, reserved for priests. The chambers built into the walls and rooms surrounding the main structure. Spaces used by temple officials, prophets, administrators, the various figures who move through the sacred precincts of the house of God. Jeremiah brings the Rechabites into one of these chambers. The text specifies that it is the chamber of the sons of Hanan, son of Igdaliah, a man of God. This is not an incidental detail. The location matters. The Rechabites are not brought into a marketplace or a government hall. They are brought into the temple itself, into a room that belongs to a prophetic figure, a man of God, which means they are standing in a sacred space, in the presence of sacred intention, under the eye of heaven. Jeremiah sets bowls and cups of wine before them. Think about what this moment looks like. There is the prophet, one of the most significant figures in Israel's spiritual history, a man whose words have been preserved and are being read thousands of years later. There is the family, multiple generations of them, the text implies, fathers and sons, the whole household of the Rechabites gathered together, and there is the wine, arranged before them, an offering of hospitality perhaps, an opportunity certainly, and Jeremiah says, "Drink wine." Now, at first reading, this might seem strange. Why would God instruct Jeremiah to offer wine to people who don't drink wine? Is this a temptation? Is it a trap designed to expose their weakness? Is Jeremiah trying to catch them in a moment of compromise? No, this is not that kind of story. What Jeremiah is doing is creating a demonstration. He is staging a visual, enacted parable, something the biblical prophets did regularly, using physical actions and symbolic gestures to make spiritual truth concrete and undeniable. God is not testing the Rechabites to see if they will fail. God already knows what they will do. The entire point of this scene is the answer, not the question. The wine is on the table not because God hopes the Rechabites will drink it, but because the refusal that follows will speak louder than any sermon. The observers in this moment, whether they are Jeremiah's disciples, temple officials, or others who witness the scene, are about to see something. They are about to see what obedience actually looks like when it is not convenient, when there is no obvious external enforcement, when the person who gave the original instruction is long dead and cannot enforce anything, when the culture all around you has moved on and would not judge you for accepting the cup. The wine is on the table, the cups are ready, and Jeremiah waits. The refusal. Chapter 4. The Rechabites decline. They do not decline rudely. They do not make a scene. They do not lecture Jeremiah or perform their righteousness for an audience. They simply explain, with evident calm and complete certainty, why they cannot accept the wine he has offered them. "We will drink no wine," they say, "for Jonadab the son of Rechab our father commanded us. You shall not drink wine, neither you nor your sons forever." And then they go further. They do not simply cite the wine prohibition. They rehearse the entire body of Jonadab's instructions, as if to make absolutely clear that the wine is not an isolated rule but part of a comprehensive way of life that they have adopted in full. They name the commandments one by one. No wine, no houses, no vineyard, no field, no seed, tents, movement, simplicity. And then they say something that carries enormous weight. They say, "We have obeyed the voice of Jonadab, the son of Rechab our father, in all that he commanded us, all our days, we and our wives, our sons and our daughters, all our days, not most days, not in private, not when it was easy, all their days, the whole household, men and women, parents and children." The instruction of a dead ancestor has woven itself so completely into the identity of this family that it is no longer experienced as an external rule, but as an internal reality. This is simply who they are. This is simply how they live. The question of whether to drink the wine that Jeremiah has placed before them does not require deliberation or struggle. There is nothing to deliberate. The answer is the same as it has always been, across every generation that came before them, through every circumstance and pressure and temptation that the world has offered. Number. And notice the texture of that number. It is not angry. It is not self-righteous. It is not delivered with the sharp edge of someone who wants to make the person offering the wine feel ashamed. The Rechabites are not performing their virtue. They are simply reporting the truth about themselves. They give Jeremiah a gracious, matter-of-fact explanation. They are not contemptuous of the wine or of those who drink it. They are simply people who do not drink wine, and they explain this the way anyone might explain a deep personal conviction, clearly, without drama, without apology. There is something almost serene about it. And then they add one more thing. They tell Jeremiah that they have been following these instructions all their days, even now, when the armies of Babylon have forced them temporarily inside the walls of Jerusalem. Even in circumstances that could have provided a perfectly reasonable justification for bending the rules. Even when the original purpose of living in tents, the freedom to move through the land, is temporarily impossible because of armed conflict in the countryside. They have not used the crisis as an excuse. They have not said, "The times have changed. The pressure is extraordinary. Surely Jonadab would understand if we adapted." They have simply continued to be what they have always been, inside whatever circumstances life has placed them in. This is the moment the demonstration has been building toward. This is the moment God has been waiting for Jeremiah to create. The lesson is ready to be spoken. God reveals the lesson. Chapter 5. The word of God comes to Jeremiah in the wake of the Rechabites' refusal, and what God says in that moment is one of the most piercing comparisons in all of prophetic literature. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, "Go and say to the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, will you not receive instruction and listen to my words, declares the Lord." The command to Israel was not obey this dead ancestor's traditions. The command to Israel was obey me, the living God who spoke from Sinai, who parted the sea, who fed them in the wilderness, who gave them the law written on stone by his own hand, who sent prophet after prophet to call them back. This God had been speaking to Judah for centuries, and Judah had refused, not because the instruction was unclear, not because the requirements were impossible, but because comfort was more appealing than obedience, because idols offered the illusion of control that the living God did not always provide, because the culture around them made compromise feel reasonable rather than catastrophic. And here are the Rechabites, obeying a human command, the command of a man who has been dead for 200 years, with perfect, unbroken fidelity across every generation of their family, simply because their father told them to. The contrast is devastating. The sons of Jonadab, the son of Rechab, God says through Jeremiah, have kept the command that their father gave them, but this people, meaning Judah, has not obeyed me. God does not present this comparison with detachment. There is something in the text that reads like grief, like the pain of a parent who has done everything to communicate love and received indifference in return. God is not simply pointing to the Rechabites as an intellectual argument or a rhetorical device. He is saying, look at what is possible. Look at what faithfulness can look like across generations. If a human ancestor can inspire this level of loyalty in his descendants, why cannot I, the God who made you, who redeemed you, who carried you through the wilderness and gave you this land, why cannot I inspire even a fraction of the same? The Rechabites, without knowing it, have become a living sermon. They walked into the temple as a displaced family seeking shelter from advancing armies. They leave having been held up before heaven and earth as the standard of what generational faithfulness looks like. They are not held up as perfect. They are not held up as sinless. They are held up for one specific, extraordinary quality. When Jonadab told them to do something, they did it, and they kept doing it, and their children kept doing it, and that keeping, that faithful, unspectacular, day after day keeping, is what God is pointing to with something that resembles longing. I sent to you all my servants the prophets, God continues, sending them persistently, saying, turn now every one of you from his evil way, and amend your deeds, and do not go after other gods to serve them, and then you shall dwell in the land that I gave to you and your fathers. But you did not incline your ear or listen to me. Persistently. The word carries such weight. God did not send one messenger. He sent many. He sent them repeatedly, urgently, across the full span of Israel's history. Isaiah, Amos, Hosea, Micah, and before them many others whose names we do not even know. Every one of them saying the same essential thing. Come back. Return. You're walking toward disaster and you do not have to. Come back. Judah did not come back, and now Babylon is coming. Judgment and Promise. Chapter 6. The judgment that follows the temple scene is not delivered with satisfaction. There is nothing triumphant in Jeremiah's prophecy against Judah. If you read the book of Jeremiah in its fullness, not just this chapter but the whole sweeping, anguished record of his ministry, you understand that he carries the coming catastrophe in his body like a wound. He is not the kind of prophet who enjoys saying, "I told you so." He would give everything to be wrong. He would give everything to see Judah repent and watch God relent, as he had seen in the story of Nineveh and Jonah, but the repentance does not come, and so the judgment must be declared. Therefore thus says the Lord, the God of hosts, the God of Israel, Behold, I am bringing upon Judah and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem all the disaster that I have pronounced against them, because I have spoken to them and they have not listened. I have called to them and they have not answered. The disaster Jeremiah pronounces is real, specific, and imminent. Babylon will come. The army of Nebuchadnezzar will surround Jerusalem. The siege will last long enough to produce famine inside the city walls. The temple, that great structure Solomon built, the house where God had placed his name, will be burned to the ground. The walls of Jerusalem will be broken down. The population will be carried away into exile, across the desert to the rivers of Babylon, where they will sit down and weep when they remember Zion. All of this is coming. And it is coming, Jeremiah makes plain, not because God is cruel, or because Babylon is righteous. It is coming because a nation that received extraordinary grace and was given extraordinary law chose, over and over again, to walk away from both. But then God turns to the Rechabites, and his tone changes. To the house of the Rechabites, God says through Jeremiah, Because you have obeyed the command of Jonadab your father, and kept all his precepts and done all that he commanded you, therefore thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, Jonadab the son of Rechab shall never lack a man to stand before me. Never lack a man to stand before me. This is the phrase that has resonated through centuries of reflection on this passage. To stand before God is a phrase associated with service, with proximity, with the honour of being in the divine presence. To have a continuous line of descendants who stand before God is one of the great covenantal promises in the Hebrew Scriptures. It is the kind of promise typically made to priests, to kings, to prophets, to figures of enormous spiritual significance. And here it is being given to a family of tent dwellers, a family of wanderers, a family that nobody in Jehoiakim's court would have recognized or respected. The contrast with Judah in this moment is almost overwhelming. Judah, the covenant nation, the descendants of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the people to whom the law was given, the people for whom the temple was built. Judah is about to lose everything. Its king will be humiliated, its city will be destroyed, its people will be exiled, the temple will be ash, and the Rechabites, who asked for nothing, who performed no miracles, who wielded no power, who have simply been faithful to their ancestors' instructions in the privacy of their nomadic life. The Rechabites receive a promise of eternal continuity in the presence of God. Heaven, it turns out, has been paying attention all along. The meaning of generational obedience. Chapter 7. There is a kind of faith that announces itself. It stands in public places and makes declarations. It performs visible acts of devotion and is recognized for them. It is the faith of kings and prophets and warriors and martyrs, figures whose stories fill the pages of history and scripture, whose courage changes the course of events. And then there is the faith of the Rechabites. It does not announce itself. It does not stand in public places and make declarations. It performs no visible acts of devotion that would distinguish it from ordinary life. The Rechabites did not fast in the city streets or pray loudly in the temple courts. They lived in tents. They wandered through the land. They declined wine when it was offered. They planted no crops and built no houses and drank no wine and said very little about any of it. They simply kept living the way Jonadab told them to live, and they kept doing it long after Jonadab was dead, and they kept doing it when the culture all around them made no such demands, and they kept doing it when armies were gathering on the horizon and the future was uncertain, and a reasonable person might have decided that this was not the time to worry about old ancestral customs. They just kept doing it. And this, it turns out, is one of the most profound forms of faith the biblical text knows how to honour. What the story of the Rechabites reveals about generational obedience is both challenging and deeply encouraging. It is challenging because it calls for a kind of faithfulness that is not glamorous. It does not call for a single dramatic moment of courage, the kind that makes for powerful testimony and memorable stories. It calls for the quieter, harder, less celebrated form of faithfulness. The faithfulness that shows up every single day, in small decisions, in private moments, in the accumulated weight of 1,000 ordinary choices made consistently in the same direction. The Rechabites did not obey Jonadab's instructions because they expected to be famous for it. There is no indication that they anticipated God would one day hold them up as an example to an entire nation. They kept the instructions because they were the instructions, because their father gave them, because that was who the Rechabites were. Their obedience was not performed for an audience. It was structural, built into the architecture of their daily existence, embedded in the habits and rhythms and choices that made up their lives. This is what the biblical text means by the word faithfulness in its deepest sense. Not the faithfulness that rises to great occasions, but the faithfulness that does not need an occasion to rise to because it has already become the texture of ordinary life. There is also something profound here about the power of a single ancestor's decision to shape the future. Jonadab, son of Rechab, has been dead for more than 200 years by the time the events of Jeremiah 35 unfold. He cannot see what his descendants are doing. He cannot encourage them, or correct them, or reward them for their obedience. He is entirely absent, and yet his instructions are alive. They are walking around in the bodies and habits and choices of his children's children's children. His decision to speak clearly and carefully about how his family should live has outlasted him by centuries. This is the extraordinary gift and responsibility of parents in every age. The decisions you make about how to live, the values you articulate and embody, the disciplines you practice and pass on, these do not die when you die. They continue. They either continue as living faithfulness, as they did in the house of Rechab, or they fade into irrelevance, or they are distorted and eventually abandoned. But they continue in some form. The question is not whether your life will influence the generations that come after you. The question is what kind of influence it will be. Jonadab made clear decisions and then trusted his children to live them out. He did not try to control them from beyond the grave with elaborate enforcement mechanisms. He simply said, "This is how we live, and here is why, and I'm asking you to continue it." And they did, for generations, because the instructions made sense, because the way of life they described had its own internal coherence and integrity, because living simply and wandering freely and abstaining from the corrupting influence of wine and the anchoring weight of permanent property had preserved in them a quality of spiritual alertness and dependence that made the instructions feel worth keeping. The Rechabites also demonstrate something important about the relationship between discipline and identity. Their ancestral commandments were not simply a list of things they were not allowed to do. They were the definition of who the Rechabites were. To drink wine would not merely have broken a rule. It would have been a statement about who they were becoming. It would have been the beginning of a transformation away from the Rechabite identity towards something else. This is why they refused Jeremiah's offer, not with tortured hesitation, but with simple clarity. The wine is not tempting to them because they are not the kind of people who drink wine. The identity is so deeply formed that the temptation does not have a natural point of entry. This is one of the great insights of the Rechabite story for any person of faith in any age. The most effective protection against the corrosive pressures of a culture that is moving away from God is not primarily a set of prohibitions. It is an identity. People who know deeply who they are do not need to resist temptation with great effort, because the temptation does not feel like an opportunity. It feels like a contradiction. The Rechabites were not white-knuckling their way through Jeremiah's wine offering, gritting their teeth against desire. They were simply being themselves. And that kind of identity, as the story makes clear, can be formed and preserved across generations if someone in the first generation makes the decision to build it carefully, speak it clearly, and trust the God who watches over the quiet faithfulness of ordinary families. Faithfulness over popularity. Chapter 8. One of the most quietly radical things about the Rechabites is that they were not popular. They were not celebrated in their time. They were not praised in the royal court or honoured in the temple ceremonies. They were a clan of wanderers living on the margins of a settled, urbanising society. People who, by every external measure, had chosen an inferior way of life. The world of ancient Judah in Jehoiakim's reign was moving in a very specific direction. It was moving toward settlement, toward urban life, toward agricultural wealth, toward the accumulation of property and the pleasures that property enables. The cultural pressure on everyone, including groups like the Rechabites, who existed on the fringes of that culture, was enormous. Success looked like a house. Success looked like a vineyard. Success looked like the ability to set a full table and pour a cup of wine for your guests. The Rechabites' way of life was not simply unusual. It was, in the estimation of most of their contemporaries, objectively inferior. And yet, they were the ones God pointed to when he wanted to show Judah what faithfulness looked like. There is a lesson here that transcends the ancient Near Eastern context and speaks directly into the pressure every person of faith has ever felt in every age and culture. The pressure to conform, the pressure to normalise, the pressure to adjust your convictions to match the direction the world is moving. To tell yourself that the original instructions were meant for a different time and a different context, and surely do not apply with the same force to the sophisticated, complex realities of the present. The Rechabites had been facing this pressure for 200 years. Every generation of their family had grown up surrounded by a culture that did not live the way they lived. Every generation had been implicitly or explicitly invited, by the assumptions of their society, by the example of their neighbours, by the sheer weight of cultural normalcy, to simply be like everyone else, to put down roots, to build a house, to plant a vineyard, to drink the wine when it was offered. Every generation said no, not because they were legalists, not because they had never questioned the instructions, but because the instructions had become so woven into their identity that abandoning them would have meant abandoning themselves, and because, on some deep level, they understood what their ancestor had understood, that the simplicity, the mobility, the abstinence from wine and property and the settling weight of the world was protecting something precious in them. It was keeping them free. It was keeping them alert. It was keeping them oriented towards something beyond the accumulation and comfort and distraction that consumed everyone around them. The Rechabites were not popular, but they were faithful. And in the calculus of the kingdom of God, as the story of Jeremiah 35 makes magnificently clear, those two things are not the same. Faithfulness over popularity is not a comfortable choice. It is not a choice that wins you friends or increases your social standing or makes your life easier. It is a choice that sets you apart, quietly, persistently, perhaps invisibly to most of the people around you, as someone whose primary allegiance is not to the expectations of your culture, but to the commitments of your identity. The Rechabites made that choice, and when the moment came that God needed an example, when the nation needed to see what obedience actually looked like in a body, walking around in the world, there they were, ready. Simply by virtue of having been themselves, consistently, across 200 years. The power of legacy. Chapter 9. Let us dwell for a moment on Jonadab, son of Rechab, and what his story teaches about legacy. We do not know very much about Jonadab. He appears briefly in 2 Kings, climbing into Jehu's chariot. He gives his family their defining instructions, and then he disappears from the text. We do not know how he died. We do not know how many children he had. We do not know whether he was considered wise or unusual or even eccentric in his own time. We do not know whether he expected his instructions to be followed for 200 years, or whether he simply hoped they would last until the next generation. What we know is this. He made a decision about how his family would live, and that decision changed everything. The concept of legacy is something every human culture has grappled with. The desire to leave something behind, something that will outlast you, that will carry your name or your values or your vision forward into a future you will not see, is one of the deepest human drives. Kings build monuments, artists create works, writers compose books, parents raise children. All of these are attempts to project something of yourself into the future, to ensure that your existence left some kind of mark on the world. But most discussions of legacy focus on the visible, the grand, the monumental. They focus on what can be pointed to and admired. The Rechabite story points toward a different and more profound understanding of legacy. Legacy is the invisible transmission of a way of life. Jonadab did not build a monument. He did not write a book that would be preserved in the temple archives. He did not accomplish a military victory that would be celebrated in the historical annals. He gave his children instructions for how to live. He told them what to drink and not drink, where to sleep and not sleep, what to plant and not plant. He articulated a philosophy of life in the form of practical daily disciplines and said, "This is who we are." And 200 years later, God pointed to his descendants and said to an entire nation, "These people understood something you never could. That is legacy. The invisible kind. The kind that does not require stone or bronze to preserve it. The kind that lives in the habits and choices and convictions of people who may not even know the full story of why they live the way they live, who may have been taught the instructions so completely from childhood that the instructions feel less like rules than like nature, like the way water naturally flows downhill, like the way the Rechabites naturally declined wine, not because of effort but because of formation. There is a particular kind of grief in the comparison God draws in Jeremiah 35, the grief of seeing what was possible and recognizing that it was not chosen. God is looking at a nation that had received more than Jonadab ever gave his children. The Rechabites had the instructions of a good man. Judah had the law of God. The Rechabites had the example of one faithful ancestor. Judah had Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Joshua, David, Solomon, and a centuries-long history of God's miraculous involvement in their story. The Rechabites had not seen the parting of the sea or the fire on Sinai. They had not eaten manna in the wilderness or watched the walls of Jericho fall, and yet they were more faithful than the people who had seen all of those things. The power of legacy, the Rechabite story suggests, does not lie in the greatness of what you give your children. It lies in the consistency with which you live what you believe and the clarity with which you pass it on. Jonadab gave his children something simple. He gave it to them completely. He lived it himself and asked them to live it after him. And the living of it created something that 200 years of cultural pressure and political chaos and national spiritual decline could not erode. That is extraordinary, and it is available to ordinary people, to families who will never be famous, to parents who will never be celebrated, to anyone who is willing to decide what they believe, to live it faithfully, and to give it to the people who come after them. God notices quiet obedience. Chapter 10. There is a theme running through the Rechabite story that is easy to miss if you're looking for the dramatic. It is the theme of unwitnessed faithfulness, of obedience that happens when no one important is watching, that accumulates over years and decades and generations without recognition or reward, that exists simply because it is right and not because it is rewarded. The Rechabites did not fast in public. They did not announce their abstinence from wine at social gatherings, making sure everyone understood how disciplined they were. They did not draw attention to their tent-dwelling lifestyle as a form of conspicuous piety. They simply lived, quietly, consistently, out of the spotlight of their culture, in the margins where wandering tent-dwellers live when the respectable classes are building houses and planting vineyards and pouring wine. No one gave them awards for this. No one wrote songs about them. No national holiday was declared in honour of Jonadab's instructions. For more than 200 years, the Rechabites were simply a clan of people that other people thought was a bit strange. People who wandered when everyone else settled. who abstained when everyone else indulged, who maintained the simplicity of an earlier, rougher way of life in an era of increasing sophistication and urbanization. And God noticed. This is one of the most comforting and clarifying things about the Rechabite story. Not comforting in the sense of comfortable, but comforting in the sense of reassuring. It reassures us that the invisible faithfulness is seen, that the choices you make in private, the convictions you maintain when there is no external reward for maintaining them, the long, slow work of keeping your commitments across decades, all of this is registered by someone. Jesus would say something similar centuries later. He would say that your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. He would commend the woman who gave 2 coins quietly, while wealthy donors made a show of their large gifts. He would describe a kingdom that works like yeast in dough, invisible, unannounced, quietly transforming everything from the inside without drawing attention to itself. The Rechabites lived that kingdom parable before Jesus ever told it. They are the secret yeast, the hidden light, the quiet faithfulness that God saw clearly even when the whole apparatus of culture and power and religious authority was looking in another direction. And when the moment came, when God needed an example, when the nation needed to be confronted with the contrast between its failure and what faithfulness actually looked like, God did not go to the temple or the palace or the schools of the prophets. He went to a family of wanderers sheltering inside the city walls to avoid an advancing army. He went to the margins. He went to the people that the culture had overlooked. He brought them into the temple, the centre, and held them up as the standard. Heaven's accounting, it turns out, is very different from the world's accounting. The world remembers kings. The world remembers battles. The world remembers the dates of empires and the names of dynasties and the great events that shift the course of civilizations. And these things matter in their way. They are real. They shape the material conditions of human life. But there is another accounting, a ledger kept by the God who formed the universe and calls the stars by name. And in that ledger, 200 years of quiet, consistent, unremarkable faithfulness by a family of tent dwellers counts for more than the thrones of kings who abandoned their covenant. This is what the Rechabite story wants you to carry with you when you leave it. Not a dramatic lesson or an overwhelming theological argument, just this simple, deep, sustaining truth. God sees the quiet obedience. God notices the small faithfulness. God's eye is on the family that says no to the wine when no one important is watching. And that seeing, that noticing, that divine attention, it is not passive. It is the kind of seeing that produces blessing, that keeps lineages alive, that plants a promise in the middle of judgment. Discipline as spiritual protection. Chapter 11. The Rechabites' lifestyle was, at its core, a system of boundaries, not arbitrary ones, not rules for the sake of rules, but carefully chosen constraints that protected specific things. Simplicity, mobility, independence from the intoxicating pull of a settled, comfortable, wine-soaked culture. It is worth pausing on each of those boundaries and asking what they were protecting against. The prohibition on wine. In the ancient world, wine was not simply a beverage. It was embedded in the entire cultural and religious life of the surrounding nations. It was used in the worship of Baal. It was present at the festivals that blurred the line between celebration and excess. It loosened the tongue and quieted the conscience, and made the night feel warmer and the compromises feel smaller. To abstain from wine was not merely a dietary choice. It was a declaration of separateness from a particular cultural ecosystem. It was saying, there is a level of ease with this world's pleasures that I will not reach. There is an intoxication, not just physical but spiritual, that I will not allow to settle into me. The prohibition on permanent houses. Houses anchor you. They fill your attention and your energy and your prayers with the concerns of the settled life. The roof that needs repairing, the wall that needs rebuilding, the property boundary that needs defending. A house gives you things to protect, which means a house gives you things to lose. which means a house can become the centre of your concern in a way that displaces God from that centre. To live in a tent is to remain structurally unprotected by anything you have built yourself. It is to be dependent every night on something beyond your own construction. The prohibition on planting. Agriculture creates the illusion of control. When you plant a seed and tend a crop and bring in a harvest, you are participating in the rhythms of creation in a way that can make the world feel manageable, predictable, yours. This is not wrong in itself, but it can quietly replace the posture of dependence with the posture of self-sufficiency, the sense that you have secured your own future through your own effort. The Rechabites could not make that trade. They were structurally dependent on provision that came from beyond their own planning and labour. They had to trust, and trust, practiced consistently across a lifetime, forms a certain kind of person, someone whose first instinct in uncertainty is not anxiety but faith, the nomadic life itself. To wander is to relinquish control. You do not know what the next day will bring. You cannot plan 10 seasons ahead. You carry only what you can carry. You settle only where you can settle. Your life is defined by movement rather than accumulation. This kind of life produces a particular quality of attention, a capacity to remain present, to be alert, to hold things loosely. It is the opposite of the complacency that settles over a people who have become secure in their own arrangements. Taken together, these disciplines were not just rules. They were a spiritual immune system. They were the set of practices that had, over generations, protected the Rechabites from the specific spiritual diseases that destroyed Judah. The diseases of idolatry, complacency, self-sufficiency, and the quiet erosion of dependence on God that comes when life becomes too comfortable and too controlled. This is what Jonadab understood that Judah's leaders did not. That discipline is not the enemy of freedom, that boundaries are not prisons, that the constraints you choose can protect the things you value most, the quality of attention, the posture of dependence, the identity rooted in something beyond what the world can offer or take away. Judah had the law. Judah had the prophets. Judah had the temple and the priests and the sacrifice system and the whole elaborate structure designed to keep God at the centre of national life. And Judah had abandoned all of it, gradually, incrementally, because the cultural pressure to absorb the practices and priorities of the surrounding nations was more immediate and more persistent than the abstract call to maintain a covenant with an invisible God. The Rechabites had tents and the instructions of a dead man, and they were more spiritually protected than the inheritors of Sinai. The difference was not in the content of the instructions, it was in the willingness to be formed by them, to let the disciplines do their work, to trust that the boundaries were not arbitrary but purposeful, to say, I do not fully understand everything Jonadab had in mind when he gave us these instructions, but I have seen enough to know that the way of life they produce is worth preserving, and so I will preserve it. That is the kind of faith that builds spiritual immunity across generations. The Fall of Jerusalem. Chapter 12. The events of Jeremiah 35 do not take place in a vacuum. They are part of a much larger story that is moving, with terrible momentum toward one of the most catastrophic moments in Israel's history. Within a few years of the temple scene with the Rechabites, everything changes. Nebuchadnezzar's army returns to Judah with decisive force. Jehoiakim dies under circumstances the text leaves deliberately vague, possibly killed, possibly dying during the siege, possibly surrendering and being taken captive and then executed. His son Jehoiakim reigns for 3 months before surrendering to Babylon and being carried into exile along with the royal family, the court officials, the craftsmen, the military leaders, the elite of the nation. Nebuchadnezzar installs Zedekiah as a vassal king. Zedekiah eventually rebels, as Jeremiah had begged him not to, and in the 9th year of his reign, Babylon comes back. The siege of Jerusalem begins. It lasts 18 months. Inside the walls, the food runs out. People begin to starve. The Book of Lamentations describes scenes of devastating suffering. Mothers boiling their own children for food, princes and elders sitting on the ground in silence covered in dust. The city that David conquered, that Solomon beautified, that centuries of Israelite history had centered on, is consuming itself from within while the Babylonian army waits patiently outside. In the summer of 586 before Christ, the walls are breached. Zedekiah tries to flee at night through the gap between the walls, heading toward the Jordan Valley. The Babylonian army overtakes him. He's brought before Nebuchadnezzar at his command post in Riblah. His sons are executed in front of him. Then his eyes are put out. He's bound in chains and carried to Babylon. He will die there, imprisoned, blind, the last king of Judah. The temple is burned. The text in 2 Kings reports it with stark simplicity. They burned the house of God and broke down the wall of Jerusalem and burned all its palaces with fire and destroyed all its precious vessels. The bronze pillars that Solomon had cast, the bronze sea, the stands, the lampstand, all of it is broken apart and carried to Babylon as plunder. The house that Solomon spent 7 years building, the structure that represented Israel's covenant with God, the place where the Shekinah glory had once descended in a cloud so heavy that even the priests could not stand to minister, it becomes ash. The population is carried away. Some are executed, some are left behind. The poorest of the poor, the people so marginal that Babylon does not consider them worth the effort of deportation. The city that had been the heart of a nation becomes a ruin. Everything that Jeremiah had been warning about for decades has happened exactly as he said it would. And in the middle of this catastrophe, in the rubble of everything Judah had been, the promise to the Rechabites stands. They will never lack a man to stand before God. There are historical traditions that suggest the Rechabites survived, and even thrived during the Babylonian period, that some of them may have served in temple roles after the return from exile, that their lineage continued in forms that later generations could trace. Whether those specific traditions are historically verifiable or not, the theological point is clear. The faithfulness that they demonstrated in the temple of Jeremiah's day is the kind of faithfulness that outlasts empires. Babylon falls to Persia. Persia falls to Greece. Greece falls to Rome. Rome falls to time. All of the great powers that dominated the ancient world, the ones that seem so permanent, so overwhelming, so insurmountable in the moment of their strength, are now subjects for archaeologists and historians, studied by scholars in universities, their emperors' names preserved only in textbooks. The Rechabites are still in the Bible, still being read, still being reflected on, still being held up by the God of that story as the example of what faithfulness looks like when culture moves in every other direction. Their tents are long folded, their wandering is finished, but their obedience echoes. The family that endured. Epilogue. You have been listening to the story of a family that no one in their own time considered important. They held no military command, they controlled no territory, they had no seat in the royal court, no voice in the national debates, no influence over the political decisions that would lead Judah toward catastrophe. They were wanderers with tents and an old man's instructions, sheltering inside the walls of a city because the countryside was too dangerous for the moment. They were ordinary people, in every external sense, in extraordinary times, and yet God noticed them. God pointed to them in the middle of a national crisis as the single most compelling example of faithfulness that he could find in all of Judah. Not among the priests, not among the Levites, not among the scholars who had devoted their lives to studying the law, not among the prophet's disciples who had sat at Jeremiah's feet learning the ways of the Spirit. Among the tent dwellers, among the people who drank no wine and built no houses and planted no crops and made no impression on the cultural landscape of their world. The Rechabites teach us something essential about the nature of faithfulness, that it is not primarily about visibility. It is not about the grandeur of what you do or the audience before whom you do it. It is about the daily, quiet, consistent alignment of your choices with your convictions, sustained across time, passed on to the people who come after you, maintained even when the culture has moved in every other direction and no one around you is asking questions about why you live differently. The greatest testimony, the story suggests, is sometimes simply this: refusing to abandon what is right, not with drama, not with heroic confrontation, not with public declarations or conspicuous sacrifice, just by continuing to be, day after day, who you said you would be, by teaching your children what you believe and watching them teach their children, by keeping the instructions not because you are forced to, but because you understand what they protect, and you value what they protect, and you have decided that the cost of keeping them is worth it. History remembers kings, it remembers wars, it remembers the dates of empires and the names of dynasties and the battles that changed the course of civilizations. These things matter. They shape the world you live in. They deserve to be studied and remembered. But there is another kind of remembering. The Rechabites were remembered where it matters most, not in the annals of Judah's kings, not in the military records of the campaigns against Babylon. They were remembered in the words that God himself spoke through a prophet, in a room inside the temple, on a day when a man who would not be there to hear them said to a family, "Drink this wine." And they said no. And God said, "I have seen you. I have seen every generation of you, keeping your father's instructions in the silence of the countryside while this nation collapsed around you. I have seen the cups you declined, and the vineyards you refused to plant, and the houses you refused to build, and the tents you carried through the wilderness of this world. I have seen all of it, and the line that never stops, the man who always stands before me, the family that refused to change." Hello, beloved friends. Before we begin tonight's journey into peaceful rest, I'd love to know where in the world you're joining from and what time it is in your corner of creation. The gentle voice of the shepherd reaches across all borders and time zones. If these stories bring you comfort and peace, please remember to subscribe to Sacred Rest for more scripture-inspired sleep journeys. Now, let us quiet our minds and open our hearts as we listen for the voice of the Good Shepherd. In the quiet of this moment, I invite you to find a comfortable position. Perhaps you're already settled in bed, your head resting on your pillow, or maybe you're preparing for rest after a long day. Wherever you are, however you've arrived at this moment, know that you are welcomed here with tenderness and care. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Feel the weight of your body surrendering to the support beneath you. Notice how your shoulders can soften, how your hands can rest without grasping, how your face can release any tension it's been holding. There's nothing you need to do right now except breathe and listen. Let's breathe together for a moment. Inhale slowly through your nose, feeling the cool air fill your lungs. Hold it gently for just a moment, and then exhale through your mouth, releasing anything that doesn't serve your peace. Inhale comfort. Exhale worry. Inhale divine peace. Exhale human striving. Inhale rest. Exhale burden. With each breath, you're creating space within yourself. Space for stillness, space for quiet, space for the gentle voice that calls you by name. I invite you now to begin visualizing a journey. As you continue breathing slowly and deeply, imagine yourself walking along a narrow country path. It's late afternoon, and the golden light of the setting sun bathes everything in a warm glow. The air is perfect, not too warm, not too cool, and carries the sweet scent of wildflowers and fresh grass. The path winds gently through rolling hills. With each step you feel more of your daily concerns falling away. The emails waiting for responses, the conversations that left you wondering, the tasks still uncompleted, all of these can wait outside this peaceful moment. As you walk, you notice the sound of birdsong in the distance, not the busy chattering songs of morning birds, but the gentle settled sounds of evening, soft calls that seem to whisper, all is well, rest is coming. The path begins to crest a small hill, and as you reach the top you see before you a wide meadow. The grass sways gently in a soft breeze, creating waves of movement like a green sea. Scattered throughout are wildflowers in gentle hues, pale yellows, soft whites, and tender purples. At the far edge of this meadow, you can just make out the stone walls of an ancient sheepfold, a place of gathering, a place of safety, a place of rest. This is where our journey is taking us tonight, to the sheepfold of the Good Shepherd. As you descend the hill toward the meadow, you feel a sense of being both completely free and completely held. The vast open sky above reminds you of boundless possibility, while the path beneath your feet assures you that you're being guided. With each step, your breathing continues to deepen. Your inhales become fuller, your exhales become longer. Your mind begins to quiet like waters settling after a storm. The path now leads you into the meadow itself. The grass reaches up past your ankles, brushing against you with feather-like touches. You can feel the earth beneath your feet, solid, supportive, ancient. As you walk, you begin to notice the sounds of sheep in the distance, not loud or disturbing, but the gentle bleating that speaks of contentment and security. They're calling to one another as they make their way toward the sheepfold for the night. And then you hear something else, a voice. Low and warm, it carries across the meadow with remarkable clarity. It's not calling to you, not yet, but to the sheep. And you notice how they respond, turning their heads, adjusting their path, moving with purpose toward the voice. This is the voice of the shepherd, calling his sheep to evening rest. Each one knows this voice intimately. Each one trusts this voice implicitly. Each one follows this voice instinctively. As you continue your walk through the meadow, drawn toward the sheepfold just as the sheep are drawn, you begin to feel a sense of recognition stirring within you. Something about this voice awakens a deep memory, not from yesterday or last year, but from the very foundation of your being. It's as if your soul remembers this voice from before time began. The path begins to widen as you near the sheepfold. The stone walls become clearer now, smooth, weathered stones carefully placed one upon another by hands that understood the importance of creating sanctuary. These walls have stood through countless seasons, through rain and wind and snow and sun, remaining steadfast in their purpose, to protect, to shelter, to create a space of safety. As you draw nearer, you see the entrance to the sheepfold, a simple opening in the wall. There is no gate of wood or metal, for in this place, in this story, the shepherd himself serves as the gate. Nothing enters that is not first approved by him. Nothing threatens that is not first faced by him. The voice continues to call, naming each sheep individually, knowing each one's unique needs, tendencies, and nature. And as the sun begins to sink lower in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the meadow, you find yourself at the entrance to the sheepfold, ready to cross the threshold into deeper rest. As you stand at the entrance to the sheepfold, you pause to take in its simple beauty. The circular stone walls rise about 4 feet high, tall enough to keep the sheep secure, yet low enough that the shepherd can see over them to watch for any approach of danger. The stones themselves seem to hold stories, their surfaces marked by time and weather, yet their arrangement remains sturdy and true. The ground inside the sheepfold has been softened by the passage of countless sheep over many years. What might once have been rocky earth has become a cushioned, almost velvety surface, perfect for rest. In some areas, particularly along the inside edge of the wall, tufts of soft grass have grown, creating natural pillows for weary heads. You notice that while the day remains warm, there is a coolness gathered in the shadows of the walls, a reminder that night approaches and with it the deeper rest that darkness brings. The air here carries a different quality. Sheltered from the breeze that moves across the open meadow, it feels somehow more concentrated, more present. As you step inside, crossing the threshold where the shepherd stands watch, you feel a subtle shift in your awareness. The sounds of the wider world seem to soften. The concerns that normally occupy your thoughts recede further. Here, within these ancient walls, existence becomes simpler. There is no need to navigate complex decisions or manage difficult relationships. There is only the present moment, the approaching night, and the protective presence of the shepherd. You find a place to sit against the wall where the last rays of sunlight still warm the stones. From here, you can watch as the sheep continue to arrive, each responding to its name when called, each receiving a gentle touch from the shepherd as it passes by him into the fold. This is how it has been done for thousands of years in the hill country. This ancient rhythm of call and response, of leaving the wide pastures for the secure fold, of trusting the one who leads and protects. Nothing about this scene would look unfamiliar to someone from centuries past. The relationship between shepherd and sheep transcends time, speaking to something essential about care and trust. In ancient times, you remember hearing, shepherds would often combine their flocks during the day, allowing the sheep to graze together in larger numbers. But when evening came, each shepherd would call only to his own sheep, using distinctive sounds or words that only his flock recognized. Remarkably, the sheep would separate themselves, following only the voice they knew, never confused by the calls of other shepherds. As you observe this evening gathering, you notice the care with which the shepherd examines each sheep as it enters. His hands move gently over wool and skin, checking for injuries or thorns that might have been gathered during the day's wandering. For one sheep, he removes a small burr caught in the thick wool. For another, he applies a soothing balm to a minor scrape. No need goes unnoticed, no discomfort goes untended. The sheep themselves seem to welcome this attention. Though some are clearly tired from the day's grazing, they pause willingly for the shepherd's examination. There is trust in their stillness, contentment in their patience. They know these hands, they know this voice, they know they are cared for individually, specifically, attentively. As the fold fills with more sheep, you notice the distinctive sounds they make. Not the loud bleating of alarm, but the soft, low sounds of recognition and settlement. They are talking to each other, and to the shepherd in their own language of belonging. The air begins to cool more noticeably as the sun touches the horizon. Long shadows stretch across the sheepfold, and the stone walls now provide not just security, but shelter from the light evening breeze. The shepherd moves among the gathered sheep, his presence clearly bringing them comfort. Some draw closer to him as he passes, seeking the reassurance of proximity. You watch as he kneels beside one sheep that seems particularly restless. He speaks softly to it, words you cannot quite hear from where you sit, but you can see the effect. The sheep's breathing slows, its movement still. Its eyes close in what can only be described as surrender to care. This, you realise, is what true safety looks like. Not the absence of all threat, but the presence of one who is trustworthy enough to allow complete vulnerability. The sheep do not need to remain vigilant because the shepherd stays watchful. They do not need to worry about provision because the shepherd knows where the sweet water flows and the tender grass grows. They do not need to fear the darkness because the shepherd's sight penetrates what they cannot see. As twilight deepens into early evening, a profound quiet descends upon the sheepfold. The activities of the day, the walking, the grazing, the occasional startled running, have given way to stillness. Energy spent has prepared the way for deep restoration. The shepherd now sits at the entrance to the fold, his back against one of the stone walls, his staff across his lap. From this position, he can see both outward across the meadow and inward to the gathered flock. Nothing approaches without his knowledge. Nothing disturbs without his permission. In this ancient pattern, in this timeless scene, you feel your own breathing continuing to slow, your own thoughts continuing to quiet. The simple rightness of this place seeps into your awareness. The stone walls that have sheltered generations, the soft earth that welcomes rest, the attentive presence that makes vulnerability safe. As night begins to embrace the world outside the fold, you feel yourself drawn deeper into the peace of this sanctuary. The voice of the shepherd, which first called across the meadow, now speaks in the silence of complete trust. And though no words are spoken aloud, you understand with perfect clarity. You are known. You are seen. You are safe. As the night deepens around the sheepfold, the stars begin to appear overhead. First one, then another, then suddenly a multitude, transforming the darkness into a vast canvas of light. The shepherd remains at his post, a silhouette of watchful presence against the night sky. In this moment of perfect stillness, words from ancient scripture rise in your mind, words that have brought comfort to countless souls through the centuries. The 10th chapter of John's Gospel, where Jesus describes himself as the Good Shepherd, speaks with particular resonance in this place of safety and rest. Listen now, as the words flow gently into your consciousness. Very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. Pause and consider this image of the gate. In ancient sheepfolds like this one, the shepherd would often position himself in the opening of the wall, literally becoming the gate. Nothing could enter without passing by him first. No predator could threaten, no thief could steal, no sheep could wander away without encountering the shepherd's watchful presence. Imagine now what it means to have such protection. Not a cold barrier of wood or metal, but a living, attentive guardian who knows each one by name. This is not distant security, but intimate care. This is not impersonal safety, but relationship-based protection. The words continue to unfold. I am the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd, and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. Reflect on the difference between hired protection and devoted care. The difference is not in skill or strength, but in relationship and commitment. The Good Shepherd's connection to the sheep is not a transaction but a bond. His protection flows not from duty but from love. As you gaze across the sheepfold, you can see this truth embodied in the shepherd's posture, alert but relaxed, vigilant but peaceful. His attention never wavers, yet it carries no tension. This is the watching that comes from love rather than obligation. The sacred text continues, "I am the Good Shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep." Imagine being known, fully known, and still loved without hesitation. Not the surface knowing of casual acquaintance, but the deep knowing that sees every fear, every hope, every quiet corner of your heart. The shepherd knows when you are afraid, when you are lonely, when you are in pain. He knows when you have wandered, when you have stumbled, when you have fallen, and still he calls your name with tenderness. This knowing is not one-directional. The sheep also know their shepherd. They recognize his voice among all others. They trust his guidance without question. They follow his leading with confidence because experience has taught them that he brings them to good places, to fresh water, to green pastures, to safe rest. As these words settle into your spirit, another passage emerges. My sheep listen to my voice. I know them, and they follow me. I give them eternal life, and they shall never perish. No one will snatch them out of my hand. There is a certainty in these words, a promise of security that transcends physical safety. The shepherd's care extends beyond the immediate dangers of wolves and thieves to the deeper threats of meaninglessness and separation. His protection covers not just the body but the soul. His provision satisfies not just physical hunger, but spiritual longing. As you reflect on these words, you notice the sheep in the fold have arranged themselves in a pattern that seems both random and intentional. Some cluster together for warmth, others maintain a small space of separation. Some lie with their heads toward the centre, others face the walls. Each has found the position that brings them comfort, yet all remain within the protective circle of the shepherd's care. Is this not a beautiful picture of community within security? Unity without uniformity? Each sheep is different, in size, in age, in temperament, yet all are equally valued, equally protected, equally known by name. The night has fully embraced the world now. The meadow beyond the sheepfold lies invisible in darkness, but here within the circle of stone walls there is no fear of what cannot be seen. The shepherd's presence transforms the night from a time of vulnerability to a season of rest. One more passage rises in your awareness. I have other sheep that are not of the sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. These words speak of expansion, of inclusion, of a circle of care that continues to widen. The shepherd's heart is not limited to those already gathered, but extends to those still wandering, still searching, still unsure of where they belong. As you let these ancient words settle deeply into your consciousness, you notice that the rhythm of your breathing is synchronized with the gentle rise and fall of the sleeping sheep around you. There is a harmony here, a natural community formed not by effortful connection, but by shared trust in the one who watches over all. The shepherd's eyes meet yours across the sheepfold, and in that glance you understand you too are invited into this circle of care. You too are known by name. You too are welcome to rest under the watchflies of the one who never slumbers. As the night grows deeper, something remarkable happens. The scene around you begins to shift, not in a jarring way, but with the gentle transformation of a dream unfolding. The walls of the sheepfold seem to dissolve, and you find yourself no longer sitting against the stones, but standing in an open field just as dawn begins to break on the horizon. The sheep are rising from their rest, stretching and shaking the night stillness from their bodies. The shepherd moves among them, speaking softly to each one, calling names that sound like music in the morning air. He turns to you now, his eyes finding yours with a gaze that feels at once ancient and immediate. With a small gesture of his hand, he invites you to join him as he prepares to lead the flock to fresh pastures. You rise and move toward him, feeling neither rushed nor hesitant. There is a rightness to this moment, as if it has been waiting for you through all the days of your life. "Come," he says, his voice both gentler and more compelling than you imagined. "Walk with me a while." As the sheep begin to follow the shepherd out into the wider fields, you find yourself walking alongside him. Not ahead, not behind, but beside, close enough to hear his breathing, to notice the deliberate placement of his feet on the earth, to feel the subtle movements of the air as he lifts his staff to guide the way. The morning unfolds around you in a symphony of sensory experiences. The earth beneath your feet feels solid yet yielding, supporting each step without resistance. The cool morning air carries the mingled scents of grass, wild flowers, and the earthy wool of the sheep. Light increases gradually as the sun climbs higher, illuminating the landscape in stages, first outlining the hills in gold, then filling the valleys with amber light, finally bathing everything in the clear radiance of full morning. You notice that the shepherd does not hurry. His pace is steady but unhurried, considerate of the youngest lambs and the oldest ewes. There is no sense of urgency, no anxiety about reaching a destination by a certain time. The journey itself holds as much importance as the arrival. The sheep need movement, the shepherd explains, seeming to read your thoughts, but they also need to feel secure in that movement. Too fast and they become anxious. Too slow and they begin to wander. The right pace creates both progress and peace. As you walk, you begin to notice how the sheep respond to the shepherd's voice. When he calls to one that has strayed too near a thorny thicket, it immediately adjusts its path. When he makes a particular clicking sound, the entire flock knows to pause and wait. When he sings a low melodic note, they gather more tightly together. "They know my voice," he says simply, "not just its sound, but its meaning." The path begins to ascend a gentle hill. As you climb, you notice how the shepherd positions himself, sometimes ahead to lead the way, sometimes behind to encourage those who lag, sometimes at the side to prevent wandering toward unseen dangers. The greatest deception, he comments, is the belief that freedom means absence of guidance. True freedom comes from trusting the one who sees what you cannot see. From the top of the hill, you can see the landscape spread out in all directions. To the east, where you've come from, the sheepfold stands solid and familiar. To the west, your direction of travel, a wide valley opens up, green with the new grass and dotted with the blue of morning flowers. To the north and south, other hills rise, creating a natural corridor for your journey. The shepherd pauses here, allowing the sheep to rest for a moment and take in the wider view. He stands slightly apart, his eyes scanning the horizon with attentive care. You understand that he is looking for signs of danger, assessing weather patterns, planning the safest route forward. "Every step we take has been imagined before we take it," he says, again responding to your unspoken thoughts. "I walk these paths in my mind before I walk them with my feet. That is how I can lead with confidence even into new territories." As the journey resumes, you begin to notice the distinct personalities of the sheep around you. Some walk with the confidence of experience, staying close to the shepherd out of choice rather than fear. Others move with the uncertainty of youth, sometimes darting ahead, sometimes falling behind, requiring more of the shepherd's attention. One sheep in particular catches your notice and slightly smaller than the others, with a slight limp that suggests an old injury. This one stays especially close to the shepherd, often walking directly beside him on the opposite side from where you walk. "This one knows her need," the shepherd says, his voice warm with affection. "She learned through difficulty what some never learn through ease. that proximity to me is better than independence from me. The sun is higher now, warming the air and bringing out the sweet scent of the crushed grass beneath your feet. The path descends into the valley, where a small stream cuts through the field, creating a natural stopping place. The sheep move eagerly toward the water, their thirst evident in their quickened pace. The shepherd guides them to the calmest part of the stream, where the water flows gently and the banks slope gradually. Here the sheep can drink without danger, refreshing themselves in the clear water. You kneel beside the stream yourself, cupping your hands to bring the cool water to your lips. It tastes sweeter than any water you've known before, clean and life-giving. Rest here a while, the shepherd says, settling himself on a smooth rock nearby. The journey continues, but never without restoration along the way. As you sit by the stream, watching the sheep drink and then begin to graze on the lush grass that grows along the banks, you feel a profound sense of being exactly where you are meant to be. There is no striving in this moment, no anxiety about what comes next, no regret about what came before. There is only the present reality of being on the path with the shepherd, moving at his pace, resting at his direction, continuing under his care. The soft sound of the stream, the gentle movements of the grazing sheep, the watchful presence of the shepherd, all combine to create a sense of security so deep that you feel your entire being relaxing into it. This is what it means to be truly led, truly guided, truly known. As the sun reaches its zenith, bathing the valley in golden light, you close your eyes for a moment, allowing the warmth to wash over you. In this perfect stillness, you hear the shepherd's voice once more, not speaking to the sheep now, but to you. The path continues beyond what you can see, but do not be anxious about what lies ahead. I have walked it already. I know every turn, every hill, every valley, and I will never lead you anywhere that I have not prepared for you. As the afternoon light begins to soften, casting longer shadows across the valley, you open your eyes to find the shepherd standing before you, his hand extended in invitation. "Come," he says simply. "There is something I want to show you before the day ends." You rise and follow him, noticing that the sheep have settled into a gentle rhythm of grazing. They seem content to remain in this lush valley for now, secure in the knowledge that the shepherd remains near. He leads you to a small rise overlooking the stream, where a single tree offers dappled shade. Its branches spread wide, creating a natural canopy that filters the sunlight into patterns of gold and shadow on the ground below. "Sit with me here," he says, settling himself against the trunk of the tree. As you join him in the shade, you realize you can see the entire flock from this vantage point. Every sheep is visible, from the confident leaders to the hesitant followers, from the strong to the vulnerable. The shepherd's gaze moves over them with attentive care, missing nothing. "Do you see how they graze without fear?" he asks. "They do not worry about predators or storms or scarcity. They have learned through experience that I provide what they need. I protect them from what would harm them. I guide them to places of abundance." You watch as the sheep move slowly through the grass, tapping to eat, occasionally looking up to confirm the shepherd's presence, then returning to their grazing with peaceful assurance. "This is the gift I offer," the shepherd continues, "not the absence of all danger, but the presence of constant care, not the elimination of all difficulty, but the assurance of never facing it alone. Particularly small lamb catches your attention. It must be one of the newest born to the flock. It stays close to its mother, occasionally frolicking in short bursts of energy before returning to her side. Its wool is especially white, almost luminous in the afternoon light. The youngest ones, the shepherd observes, following your gaze, sometimes need to be carried. When the path grows steep or the day grows long, I lift them into my arms and bear their weight. They learn trust through being held. You consider this, the image of the strong shepherd carrying the vulnerable lamb, not with impatience at its weakness, but with tenderness for its need. "Do you know," he asks, turning to look directly at you, "that I would leave the 99 to find the one? If a single sheep wanders away, becomes lost, falls into danger, I go after it, not because it is more valuable than the others, but because each one is irreplaceable to me. Each one is known by name. Each one matters uniquely." The depth of commitment in his voice moves you deeply. This is not the impersonal care of a distant guardian, but the passionate attention of one who loves specifically, individually, completely. "The Good Shepherd," he continues, "lays down his life for the sheep, not because the sheep have earned such sacrifice, but because the shepherd's love makes them worth any cost." As he speaks these words, the light shifts, taking on the golden quality of late afternoon. The air grows still, as if the world itself is listening to this truth. "Many voices will call to you," the shepherd says softly, "some offering easier paths, some promising quicker rewards, some threatening what will happen if you don't follow them. But remember, my sheep know my voice. They recognize it among all others because they have spent time listening, because they have experienced its reliability, because they have found that following it always leads to life." He reaches out and places his hand on your shoulder, the weight of it both grounding and reassuring. "You are not alone in the fields of this world," he says. "Even when you cannot see me, I am watching. Even when you cannot hear me clearly, I am speaking. Even when you wander, I am seeking. This is the promise I make to each one who belongs to me. You will never be forgotten, never be abandoned, never be left without guidance." The sun is beginning its descent toward the horizon now, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Soon it will be time to lead the sheep back to the safety of the fold for the night. "Trust and rest," the shepherd says, his voice a gentle command. "These are the twins of peace. Trust that I know the way forward. Rest in the knowledge that you are watched over. Together they create a quiet heart even in the midst of a noisy world." As these words settle into your spirit, you notice that your breathing has slowed to match the shepherd's. Deep, unhurried breaths that seem to draw peace directly from the air around you. Your body feels heavy with relaxation, as if every muscle has decided at once to release its tension. "The voice of love is always near," the shepherd murmurs, his words becoming almost musical in their rhythm. "Calling you by name, inviting you to follow, promising presence through every valley and on every mountain top." The sheep are beginning to gather more closely now, sensing the approaching evening. Their movements become slower, their grazing more intermittent. They are preparing for the journey back to the fold. Step by step, you are led to peace, the shepherd continues, his voice growing softer, not in great leaps or sudden flights, but in the patient unfolding of a path walked in trust. Each day has its portion of guidance, each moment carries its own light. He rises now, stretching his arms wide as if to embrace the entire flock at once. The setting sun behind him creates a halo effect, illuminating his outline with golden light. "It is time to return to the fold," he says, extending his hand to help you rise. "The day's journey concludes, but the care never ends. Through the night I watch, through the darkness I guard. When morning comes again, we continue the path together." As you stand, you feel a profound sense of renewal, as if the simple act of walking with the shepherd, listening to his voice, observing his care for the sheep has restored something essential within you. The worries that had weighed on your mind seem distant now, replaced by a calm certainty that you are known, you are valued, you are guided. The shepherd lifts his voice in a distinctive call that immediately draws the attention of every sheep. They respond with remarkable unity, moving toward him from all directions, gathering into a more cohesive group for the journey home. This is how it has always been, he explains as you begin to walk beside him, the flock following behind. The sheep scattered in feeding, gathered in travelling, diverse in their individual needs, united in their common trust, each one unique, yet part of a greater whole. The path back to the sheepfold seems somehow shorter than the journey out, as if the familiarity of returning home compresses distance itself. The evening light casts long shadows ahead of you, leading the way toward rest. "You're safe," the shepherd says, his voice now barely above a whisper. "You're loved. You're guided." These words repeat like a gentle refrain as you walk, matching the rhythm of your steps, synchronizing with your heartbeat. They are not just sounds, but promises, not just comfort, but truth. They sink deeply into your consciousness, creating a foundation of peace that feels both new and somehow always known. As the sheepfold comes into view, its stone walls glowing with the last light of day, you feel a sense of completion. Not the end of a glory, but the closing of a circle that will open again with the dawn. The shepherd leads the flock through the entrance, counting each one, greeting each by name, ensuring that all who went out have returned safely. When the last sheep has entered the fold, the shepherd takes his place at the gateway, his staff across his knees, his gaze moving between the gathered flock and the darkening landscape beyond. He is the living gate, the constant guardian, the embodiment of care that does not slumber or sleep. "Rest now," he says to you, his eyes holding yours with gentle intensity. The shepherd knows your name. The shepherd calls you to rest. The voice of love is always near. As night embraces the world once more, as stars begin to appear in the darkening sky, you feel yourself surrounded by perfect peace, held in the care of the one who calls you by name, who leads you beside still waters, who restores your soul. In this sanctuary of trust, sleep comes not as escape but as gift, not as absence but as presence in the watchful love of the Good Shepherd. Thank you for joining me on this peaceful journey with the Good Shepherd. If these words have brought you comfort tonight, please consider subscribing to Sacred Rest for more scripture-inspired sleep stories. And I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. May you rest deeply in the knowledge that you are watched over with perfect care through this night and always. Before we begin tonight's journey into one of the Bible's most overlooked blessings, I want to ask something that would mean the world to me. If you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel grow in ways you possibly couldn't imagine, and it allows me to continue bringing you these stories week after week. If you're listening over on Spotify, leaving a review genuinely makes such a massive difference. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting me know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening. It creates this amazing global community of people seeking truth, mystery and peace in these stories. And of course, if you enjoy what you hear tonight, subscribing to the channel ensures you never miss another deep dive into the stories that shaped history, faith and the human experience. Now let's talk about something powerful. Let's talk about a blessing so unexpected, so undeserved, that the man who received it wasn't even looking for it. There are moments in history when something sacred pauses, not because God withdraws, not because the blessing ends, but because people become afraid to move forward. Fear has a way of freezing progress. It halts celebration. It turns joy into anxiety. And sometimes, in those moments of collective paralysis, God finds someone who isn't looking for glory. Someone who simply says yes when everyone else is saying no. Tonight's story is about one of those people, a man whose name most Christians have never heard, a man who wasn't a prophet, wasn't a priest, wasn't royalty. He was simply available. And in his availability, he discovered something profound, that God's presence, when honoured rightly, doesn't bring destruction. It brings blessing beyond measure. This is the story of Obed-Edom, a man who became a footnote in Scripture, but whose quiet faithfulness reveals one of the most beautiful truths about how God works. Sometimes the greatest blessings come not to those who chase them, but to those who simply open their doors when everyone else has locked theirs. Let's begin with a celebration that ended in tragedy, and a journey that stopped in the most unexpected place. Chapter 1. The Ark returns. The city of David was alive with anticipation. After years of waiting, after generations of separation, the Ark of the Covenant was finally coming home. King David had united the tribes, conquered Jerusalem, and now sought to bring the very presence of God into the heart of his new capital. This wasn't just a religious ceremony. This was the culmination of David's vision for Israel, a nation centered not on military might or political power, but on worship, on the presence of the living God dwelling among his people. The preparations had been extensive. 30,000 chosen men from Israel gathered for the occasion. Musicians practiced their instruments. Singers rehearsed their songs. The streets were decorated. The atmosphere was electric with expectation. The Ark itself carried profound significance. This wasn't merely a religious artifact. According to the accounts passed down through generations, this wooden chest overlaid with pure gold represented the very throne of God on earth. Inside it lay the stone tablets inscribed with the 10 Commandments, a jar of manna from the wilderness, and the staff of Aaron that had budded miraculously. But more than its contents, the Ark represented something Israel had lost, the manifest presence of God. Years earlier, the Ark had been captured by the Philistines during a disastrous battle. Though it had been returned after bringing plagues upon its captors, it had never made it to Jerusalem. It had remained in obscurity, in the house of a man named Abinadab, in a town called Kiriath Jearim. Now David was bringing it home. The day of the procession arrived with perfect weather and perfect enthusiasm. The Ark was loaded onto a new cart built specifically for this purpose. Uzzah and Ahio, sons of Abinadab, guided the cart. They had grown up in the house where the Ark resided. They were familiar with its presence. David and all Israel celebrated before the Lord with all their might. The sound of lyres, harps, tambourines, sistrums and cymbals filled the air. The king himself danced before the Ark, leading his people in worship. This was supposed to be the greatest day in Israel's recent history. The procession moved slowly, deliberately. Every step was meant to be savoured. This was a moment of national unity, spiritual renewal, and royal triumph. David had planned everything perfectly, or so he thought. Chapter 2. A sudden tragedy. The road from Kiriath Jearim to Jerusalem was not particularly long, but it was uneven in places. The cart carrying the Ark moved carefully along the path, surrounded by celebration and song. Then, at a place that would later be remembered as the threshing floor of Naasson, something went wrong. The oxen stumbled. Whether they hit a stone, lost their footing, or simply faltered under the weight, the ancient texts don't specify. What matters is what happened next. The cart lurched. The Ark shifted, and in that moment instinct overpowered instruction. Uzzah reached out his hand to steady the Ark. It was a completely natural response. The kind of thing anyone would do when something precious is about to fall. His hand touched the gold-covered wood, and immediately he fell dead beside the cart. The music stopped. The singing ceased. The celebration died in an instant. One moment, 30,000 people were rejoicing. The next, they stood in stunned silence, staring at a body lying beside the Ark of God. David's reaction was complex. The ancient text says he was angry. Angry at what had happened. Angry at the disruption of his perfect plan. Angry at God for what seemed like a harsh and inexplicable act. But beneath the anger was something deeper. Fear. Pure, overwhelming fear. How could this happen? Uzzah had grown up around the Ark. He had lived in the same house with it for years. His intentions were good. He was trying to protect it, to keep it from falling. And yet, in the instant his hand made contact, he died. The theological questions were immediate and disturbing. If the very presence of God could strike down someone trying to help, how could anyone approach it safely? How could it be moved at all? David had planned this as the crowning achievement of his reign. and now it had become a scene of death and confusion. The king stood there, watching his vision collapse. This was supposed to be a triumphant entry. Instead, it was a funeral. The people looked to him for answers, for direction, for some explanation of what had just occurred. He had none to give. In that moment, David made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't continue. He couldn't bring this ark into Jerusalem, not after what had just happened. The risk was too great. The fear was too real. Whatever blessing the ark was supposed to bring, the cost seemed too high. The journey stopped. Right there, in the middle of the road, with Jerusalem still miles away, the procession halted. The greatest religious celebration in recent memory ended in tragedy and terror, and David faced a question he hadn't anticipated. What do you do with the presence of God when you're too afraid to receive it? Chapter 3. The ark is stopped. David stood at the threshing floor, his mind racing through possibilities and problems. The ark couldn't go back to where it came from. That would be an admission of complete failure, but it couldn't continue to Jerusalem either. Not now. Not like this. The fear was too fresh, the death too recent, the confusion too profound. The king asked a question that echoed with both fear and honesty. How can the ark of the Lord ever come to me? It wasn't rhetorical. Defiance. It was genuine confusion. He wanted the presence of God in his city, but he had just witnessed that presence kill a man who simply touched it. The paradox seemed impossible to resolve. A decision had to be made immediately. The ark couldn't remain on the road. It needed shelter, protection, a temporary home while David figured out what had gone wrong and how to proceed safely. But who would take it? Who would be willing to house something that had just demonstrated such terrifying power? The ancient records don't tell us how the choice was made. Was there a discussion? Did someone volunteer? Was a house simply chosen because of proximity? What we know is this. Nearby lived a man named Obed-Edom. He was a Gittite, meaning he came from Gath, one of the Philistine cities. He was part of the community but not native-born Israelite royalty. He had no particular fame, no special status, no recorded acts of heroism or prophetic calling. He was simply a man who lived near the place where the procession had stopped, and his house became the solution to David's problem. The Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred object in Israelite religion, was carried off the road and placed in Obed-Edom's home. Not as an honour, but as a necessity. Not because he was chosen for blessing, but because someone had to take it and his house was available. One can only imagine what Obed-Edom thought when he was told the ark would be staying with him. Did he see it as a privilege or a death sentence? Had he witnessed what happened to Uzzah? Did he know the stories of what had befallen the Philistines when they captured the ark years earlier? The Philistine cities had been ravaged by plagues when they possessed the ark. Tumours broke out among the people. Rats infested their land. The ark had moved from city to city, each one desperate to get rid of it, until finally they sent it back to Israel on a cart pulled by cows, with golden offerings to appease the God of Israel. And now, that same ark was in Obed-Edom's house, the same presence that had struck down Uzzah, the same object that had brought plagues to Philistine cities, sitting in his home, with his family, for an indefinite period of time. David returned to Jerusalem without the ark. The celebration was over, the plans were abandoned, and somewhere in an ordinary house, in the care of an ordinary man, the presence of God waited. 3 months would pass before anyone checked on what was happening there. 3 months of silence, 3 months of the unknown. But in that silence, something extraordinary was occurring, something no one expected, something that would eventually change everything. Chapter 4. Introducing Obed-Edom. Let's pause and consider who this man actually was. In the grand narrative of Scripture, Obed-Edom appears suddenly, serves his purpose, and then fades into the background. Most people reading through 2 Samuel skip right past his name, but his brief appearance tells us something important about how God works. Obed-Edom was not from the priestly line. He wasn't a Levite born into the service of the tabernacle. His name suggests Edomite heritage, and the text explicitly identifies him as a Gittite. Gath was one of the 5 major Philistine cities, famous as the hometown of Goliath. Whether Obed-Edom was ethnically Philistine or simply lived among them is unclear, but what's certain is that he wasn't part of Israel's religious elite. This detail matters. The ark was supposed to be carried by Levites, handled by priests, approached with specific rituals and protocols. The law given to Moses contained explicit instructions about how the ark should be moved, who could touch it, and what precautions were necessary. David had ignored these instructions by placing the ark on a cart, copying the method the Philistines had used to return it years earlier. Now, ironically, the ark ended up in the house of a man from that same Philistine region. God's presence, rejected by the king of Israel out of fear, found temporary residence with someone outside the traditional religious system. Obed-Edom had a household. The text mentions his family later, indicating he had sons who would eventually serve in the temple. He was a working man, probably a farmer or tradesman. He lived a quiet life in a small community on the road between cities. Nothing about his background suggested he was destined for any role in Israel's history. But he had something that mattered more than credentials. He had a home, and he was willing to receive what others feared. When the ark was brought to his house, Obed-Edom faced a choice. He could have refused. He could have pointed to his non-Israelite background, his lack of priestly training, his reasonable fear of what had just happened to Uzzah. He had every logical reason to say no, but he didn't. Whether from faith, duty, or simple obedience to authority, he accepted the responsibility. The ark was placed in his home, and life continued. The sun set that first evening with the ark under his roof. His family went to sleep that night in the same house as the presence of God, and they woke up the next morning still alive. That first day became a second day, the second became a week, the week became a month, and slowly, quietly, without any public announcement or religious ceremony, something began to change in that household. Chapter 5. 3. Quiet months. The text gives us almost no details about those 3 months. No dramatic visions, no angelic appearances, no miracles recorded for posterity. Just this simple statement: the ark remained in the house of Obed-Edom for 3 months. But the absence of detail is itself significant. Silence in Scripture often means normalcy, routine, life continuing as it should. Imagine those first days. The morning after the ark arrived, Obed-Edom probably woke up half surprised to still be breathing. He had seen what happened to Uzzah. He knew the stories of the Philistine plagues. Every morning that he and his family survived must have felt like a small miracle. But as days turned into weeks, something became clear. The ark wasn't there to destroy them. Whatever had gone wrong with Uzzah, whatever had caused that sudden death, wasn't happening in Obed-Edom's house. They went about their daily routines. They worked their fields, prepared their meals, lived their lives, and the ark simply rested there, in whatever room they had designated for it. There was probably a reverence in that household, a care taken not to treat the ark casually, but there was also, gradually, a comfort. The presence of God, honoured properly, wasn't something to fear. It was something that brought peace. The ancient text doesn't tell us if Obed-Edom prayed before the ark, if he worshipped there, if he made offerings. We don't know if he talked about it with his neighbours or kept quiet about the sacred object in his home. What we know is that he treated it with the respect it deserved, maintained his household in righteousness, and let God be God in his home. And slowly changes began to appear. Not dramatic, not obvious at first, but real, tangible, measurable, the kind of changes that neighbours notice, the kind of prosperity that raises questions. His fields began to flourish, whether it was the crops growing more abundantly, the livestock thriving, or both. The productivity of his land increased noticeably. In an agricultural society where everyone's yields were roughly similar, exceptional harvests stood out. People noticed. His household grew more harmonious. Conflicts that might normally arise in any family seemed to resolve more easily. There was peace under his roof. Visitors commented on the atmosphere. Something felt different about his home. His children seemed to thrive. They grew healthy and strong. Whatever blessings flow from a godly household seemed to multiply in his family. Later records show that his sons would go on to positions of service in the temple, suggesting they grew up in an environment that shaped their character positively. And financially, everything seemed to work. Projects succeeded, investments paid off, debts were cleared, the kind of comprehensive household prosperity that makes people wonder what changed, what secret you're holding, what advantage you've gained. But Obed-Edom wasn't holding a secret or working an angle. He was simply living with the presence of God in his home, and that presence, rather than bringing the curse everyone feared, brought blessing in every area of his life. 3 months of quiet faithfulness, 3 months of treating the sacred with reverence, 3 months of simply being willing to house what others were too afraid to receive. And in that time, an unknown man became a walking testimony to a profound truth. God's presence brings blessing to those who honour it. Chapter 6. The Unexpected Blessing. Word travels in small communities. When one household suddenly begins to prosper in every measurable way, people notice, neighbours talk, visitors observe, and eventually news reaches those in authority. The reports that made their way back to David were striking. Obed-Edom's household was flourishing, not just surviving, but thriving. Everything he touched seemed to succeed. His family was at peace, his resources were multiplying, his entire household was blessed, and the blessing was directly connected to one thing. The Ark of God was in his house, the same Ark that had brought death at the threshing floor, the same presence that David had been too afraid to bring to Jerusalem, the same object that had caused plagues in Philistine cities. In Obed-Edom's house, it brought nothing but blessing. This created a profound theological moment for David. The problem hadn't been the ark. The problem hadn't been God's presence being inherently dangerous. The problem had been the improper handling of that presence. The disregard for God's specific instructions about how the ark should be moved and who should carry it. David began to research. He consulted the law. He spoke with priests and Levites, and he discovered what had gone wrong. The ark was never supposed to be on a cart in the first place. That was how the Philistines had returned it, but it wasn't how God had commanded Israel to transport it. The Levites were supposed to carry it on poles inserted through rings on its sides. Specific families had specific duties regarding its care and movement. Uzzah's death wasn't arbitrary divine anger. It was the consequence of approaching holy things in unholy ways. The reverence that should have been shown from the beginning had been replaced with expediency, an imitation of pagan practices. God's presence requires God's protocols. Blessing comes through obedience, not casual approach. But Obed-Edom, intentionally or not, had shown proper reverence. He had treated the ark with respect. He had maintained righteousness in his household. He had honoured the presence of God, and God had honoured him in return. The contrast was stark and instructive. A king with all the resources of Israel had approached God's presence carelessly and experienced tragedy. A common man with no credentials had received that same presence with reverence and experienced comprehensive blessing. The lesson was clear. God's favour isn't determined by status, but by attitude, not by position, but by posture. David heard these reports and something shifted in him. The fear that had paralysed him 3 months earlier gave way to understanding. The confusion about how to approach God's presence resolved into clarity. He knew what had to be done. He knew how to do it correctly, and most importantly, he was ready to try again. But this time, there would be no shortcuts, no copying of pagan methods, no dismissal of God's specific instructions. This time, if the ark was to come to Jerusalem, it would come the way God had prescribed from the beginning, with Levites carrying it, with proper sacrifices, with worship that honoured not just God's presence, but God's procedures. Obed-Edom had done more than house the ark. He had demonstrated something David needed to see, that God's presence is safe when God's ways are honoured, that blessing isn't withheld from those who approach the holy with proper reverence, that even someone outside the traditional religious establishment could experience God's favour by simply treating sacred things as sacred. The 3 months had served their purpose. They had been a pause in the journey, yes, but they had also been a lesson, a demonstration, a proof that the problem wasn't God's desire to bless his people. The problem was his people's failure to approach him correctly. Now David understood, and he was ready to finish what he had started. The ark would come to Jerusalem. But this time, everything would be different. Chapter 7. News reaches the king. The reports that reached David's palace were consistent and compelling. Messengers from the region around Obed-Edom's house all told variations of the same story. The household was blessed. Remarkably, comprehensively, undeniably blessed. And the blessing had begun exactly when the ark arrived. David must have felt a complex mixture of emotions hearing this news. Relief that the ark hadn't brought destruction to another household. Vindication that God's presence was meant to bless, not curse. But also perhaps a twinge of regret. 3 months of blessing had gone to someone else's house. 3 months of God's manifest presence had been in a small home on the outskirts of his kingdom rather than in his capital city where he had planned to house it. But more than any personal feelings, David saw opportunity. The pause had served its purpose. The question that had paralysed him, how can the ark of the Lord ever come to me? I now had an answer. It could come through obedience, through proper protocol, through reverence combined with joy. David assembled his advisors, priests and Levites. He explained what had happened and what he had learned. The ark was to be moved again, but this time according to God's explicit instructions. The Levites from the families of Kohath, who were designated to carry the holy objects of the tabernacle, would bear the ark on their shoulders using the poles designed for that purpose. No cart, no shortcuts, no improvisation. Sacrifices would be made, not as appeasement for past mistakes, but as worship offered in proper sequence. Every 6 steps the procession would stop and offerings would be made to God. The journey wouldn't be rushed. It would be deliberate, reverent, and filled with worship at every stage. David also made personal preparations. He would dance before the ark again, but this time wearing a linen ephod like a priest, identifying himself not primarily as king but as a worshipper. The celebration would be even greater than the first attempt, but the approach would be fundamentally different. Joy combined with reverence, celebration grounded in obedience. Word was sent to Obed-Edom. The ark would be leaving his house. The 3 months had ended. The presence of God was moving to its intended destination. For Obed-Edom, this must have been bittersweet news. The blessing of those months had been extraordinary. His household had experienced prosperity unlike anything before. But the ark had never been meant to stay permanently. It had always been passing through. The day arrived for the ark to continue its journey. David came personally, along with priests, Levites, musicians, and a crowd of worshippers. The atmosphere was different from that first attempt. There was still joy, still celebration, still music and dancing, but there was also a reverence that had been missing before, an understanding that they were handling something holy, something that required specific protocols, something that demanded respect. The Levites lifted the ark onto their shoulders. The poles rested on their shoulders as God had prescribed. They began to walk, and after 6 steps the procession stopped. Sacrifices were offered, worship was given, and then they continued. 6 more steps, another sacrifice, more worship. The journey that had been interrupted by death now continued, marked by worship at every stage. David danced before the ark with all his might. The text emphasizes his complete abandon in worship. This wasn't dignified royal ceremony. This was uninhibited joy. A king celebrating not his own power, but the presence of God among his people. The same David who had feared the ark 3 months earlier now celebrated its presence with everything in him. The procession moved through the countryside toward Jerusalem. People lined the route. The sound of trumpets, singing and shouting filled the air. This time there was no stumbling, no death, no fear. Just the steady progress of God's presence moving toward its rightful place in the centre of Israel's capital. And somewhere in that crowd, probably near the front given his recent role, was Obed-Edom. His part in the story was ending. or so it might have seemed. The ark was leaving his house. The extraordinary season of blessing was transitioning to something else. But his story wasn't over. In fact, in many ways, it was just beginning. Chapter 8. The journey resumes. The second attempt to bring the ark to Jerusalem succeeded in ways the first could never have matched. Yes, the ark reached its destination, which was the practical goal, but more importantly, the process itself became an act of worship that taught Israel something profound about approaching God. Every 6 steps the procession stopped. Bulls and fattened calves were sacrificed. The smell of burning offerings filled the air. Prayers were lifted. Songs were sung. The journey that might have been completed in hours took much longer because worship was integrated into every stage. The destination mattered, but so did the journey. Getting the ark to Jerusalem was the goal, but getting there correctly was equally important. David's dancing was legendary. The text describes it as dancing with all his might. This wasn't a few dignified steps. This was a king completely lost in worship, unconcerned with royal dignity, focused entirely on honouring God's presence. Later, his wife Michal would criticise him for it, saying he had disgraced himself by dancing so freely before the people. David's response revealed his heart. He was willing to become even more undignified than this in his worship of God. The musicians played with skill and passion. Trumpets, harps, lyres, tambourines, sistrums and cymbals created a sound of celebration that could be heard throughout the region. This wasn't background music. This was a symphony of worship, a concert of praise, a declaration through sound that God's presence was returning to dwell among his people. As the procession entered Jerusalem, the entire city came out to witness the moment. From the youngest children to the oldest elders, people lined the streets. The ark moved through the city streets, carried on the shoulders of Levites, surrounded by worship, headed toward the tent David had prepared for it on Mount Zion. Finally, the ark reached its destination. It was placed inside the tent. More sacrifices were offered. Burnt offerings and fellowship offerings were presented before the Lord. And then David did something remarkable. He blessed the people in the name of the Lord Almighty and gave gifts to everyone present. Men and women alike received portions of bread, dates, and raisins. The king celebrated God's presence by generously blessing his people. The ark was home. The journey that had started months earlier, that had been interrupted by tragedy and delayed by fear, was complete. God's presence now dwelt in the heart of Jerusalem, in the city David had established as Israel's capital. The physical and spiritual centres of the nation were now aligned, but the story doesn't end there. Because woven into the fabric of this triumph was the quiet faithfulness of a man who had made it all possible, a man who had bridged the gap between fear and faith, a man who had demonstrated that God's presence brings blessing when properly honoured. Chapter 9. Obed-Edom's lasting legacy. In the biblical narrative, many people appear briefly and then vanish from the record. They serve their purpose in the story and disappear back into history. Obed-Edom could have been one of these people. His role was over. The ark had left his house. The blessing he experienced during those 3 months could have been the entirety of his legacy. But that's not what happened. Later passages of scripture reveal that Obed-Edom's story continued, and in a beautiful way. He didn't return to obscurity. Instead, he was brought into service at the very centre of Israel's worship. 1 Chronicles records that Obed-Edom and his sons became gatekeepers for the sanctuary. This wasn't a minor position. Gatekeepers controlled access to the sacred spaces. They ensured that those who entered were supposed to be there, and that they approached with proper reverence. They protected the holy from the profane, the sacred from the common. It was a position of significant trust and responsibility. Think about the symmetry of this. A man who had faithfully guarded the ark in his home for 3 months was now entrusted with guarding the sanctuary where the ark resided. His private faithfulness became public service. His quiet obedience became recognised ministry. The text also records that Obed-Edom's sons served alongside him. 68 of his descendants are mentioned in Chronicles as serving in various capacities related to the temple and its worship. The blessing that began when the ark entered his house extended through generations. His faithfulness created a legacy that outlasted him. This wasn't about Obed-Edom seeking position or reward. Nothing in the text suggests he asked for this role or campaigned for recognition. Rather, David recognized what God had already revealed, that Obed-Edom was a man who knew how to honor God's presence, that he understood reverence, that he could be trusted with sacred things. The man from Gath, the outsider with no priestly lineage, became part of Israel's ongoing worship. His house had been blessed. Now his service would be a blessing to others. The presence that had dwelt in his home temporarily became the focus of his life permanently. There's something profoundly encouraging about this outcome. Obed-Edom didn't perform miracles. He didn't receive prophetic visions. He didn't conquer enemies or write scripture. He simply said yes when the ark needed a place to stay. He honored what was holy. He maintained righteousness in his household. And from that, simple obedience flowed blessing that extended far beyond those 3 months. His story reminds us that God sees faithfulness even when no one else is watching, that obscure obedience matters, that the way we handle what God entrusts to us, even temporarily, reveals our character and positions us for future service. Obed-Edom could have complained that he was being burdened with a responsibility he didn't ask for. He could have resented that his house was chosen out of necessity rather than honor. He could have worried about the risk rather than embracing the opportunity. Instead, he simply received what God placed in his care and honored it appropriately. And that choice, that simple, faithful choice, transformed his family's trajectory for generations. The blessing wasn't just material prosperity during those 3 months. The blessing was becoming part of something larger, something eternal. His name is written in Scripture. His faithfulness is recorded for all time. His descendants served in God's house, all because he opened his door when others were closing theirs, all because he said yes when fear would have prompted no, all because he honored the presence of God rather than fearing it. Epilogue: when God dwells with the willing. The story of Obed-Edom sits quietly in Scripture, easily overlooked between the larger narratives of King David's triumphs and failures, but within its brief telling lies a truth that echoes through every generation. God's presence brings blessing to those who receive it with reverence. Consider the progression of this story. It begins with celebration turned to tragedy. A well-meaning man dies for touching what he shouldn't have touched. Fear replaces joy. The journey stops because no one knows how to proceed safely. The presence of God becomes something people fear rather than desire. Then comes a man no one would have chosen, someone from the margins, someone with no credentials or special calling, someone who was simply available when opportunity or responsibility knocked on his door. He receives what others feared, he houses what others rejected, and in his faithful obscurity he experiences blessing that reaches the king's attention. Finally, the journey resumes, but now it's different. Now there's understanding. Now there's proper reverence combined with joyful worship. Now the protocols are followed, and God's presence reaches its intended destination, not despite the delay, but perhaps because of it. The 3-month pause with Obed-Edom wasn't a failure of David's plan. It was part of God's plan, a demonstration, a lesson, a testimony. What can we learn from this ancient story? Perhaps this: that God is less interested in our resumes than our willingness, that he honours humble obedience more than impressive credentials, that his presence transforms ordinary households into blessed households when received with reverence. Obed-Edom didn't seek the ark. It came to him. He didn't ask for blessing. It flowed from honouring what was entrusted to him. He didn't campaign for recognition. It came as a natural result of faithfulness. His entire legacy began with a simple act of receiving what God placed in his care and treating it with proper respect. There's encouragement here for anyone who feels ordinary, overlooked, or outside the circles of influence and importance. God's greatest blessings often come to those who aren't seeking the spotlight, but are simply faithful in the shadows. The house that receives God's presence with reverence becomes the house God blesses, regardless of its size, status, or location. There's also a warning here. The same presence that blessed Obed-Edom struck down Uzzah. The difference wasn't God's mood or arbitrary preference. The difference was the approach. Sacred things require sacred handling. God's presence is a blessing when honoured and a danger when treated casually. Reverence isn't optional, it's essential, but perhaps most importantly, this story reminds us that God's plans aren't derailed by our failures or delays. David's fear and confusion didn't stop God's purpose. The 3-month pause didn't prevent the ark from reaching Jerusalem. Instead, that pause created an opportunity for an unknown man to be blessed, and for all Israel to learn a crucial lesson about how to approach the holy. Sometimes what looks like delay is actually preparation. Sometimes what feels like failure is actually education. Sometimes the detours teach us what the straight path never could. Obed-Edom's house was blessed because he was willing to receive what others feared. His legacy extended beyond his lifetime because he was faithful with what he was given. His name is remembered because he said yes when yes was costly and uncertain. The question for us isn't whether we'll have opportunities to house God's presence in some literal, physical way. The question is whether we'll receive what God places in our care, whatever form that takes, with the reverence it deserves. Whether we'll honour the sacred in the midst of the ordinary. Whether we'll be faithful in obscurity, trusting that God sees and honours quiet obedience. God often blesses the homes willing to receive him quietly, not the ones seeking recognition, not the ones demanding explanation, but the ones that simply open their doors and say, "Whatever you bring, Lord, I'll honour it." That's the legacy of Obed-Edom. That's the lesson of his story. And that's the invitation extended to every person in every generation, to be the kind of dwelling, literal or metaphorical, where God's presence feels at home, where reverence and faithfulness create the conditions for blessing, where ordinary obedience leads to extraordinary grace. The ark eventually left Obed-Edom's house, but the blessing it brought never truly left. It marked his family for generations. It changed his destiny. It wrote his name into sacred history, all because when God's presence needed a home, he was willing to provide one. May we all have the courage to open our doors when others are closing theirs. May we have the faithfulness to honour what God entrusts to us. May we have the wisdom to recognise that his presence is not something to fear, but something to receive with joy and reverence. And may we discover, as Obed-Edom did, that when God dwells with the willing, blessing flows in ways we never imagined possible. Hello dear friends, and welcome back to Sacred Slumber. Before we begin tonight's story, I hope your day has been filled with blessings and peace. Whether it's morning where you are, the quiet of afternoon, or the gentle embrace of evening, know that you are exactly where God wants you to be in this moment. I'm curious about where in this beautiful world you're listening from tonight. Are you nestled in your bed in a bustling city, or perhaps finding solace in the countryside under a canopy of stars. Wherever you are, whatever time it is for you, you are welcomed here with open arms. If this story touches your heart tonight, I encourage you to subscribe to Sacred Slumber. We gather here regularly to explore the profound truths and timeless wisdom found in God's Word, bringing comfort to weary souls and strength to troubled hearts. Your subscription helps us continue sharing these sacred stories that remind us of God's unfailing love and faithfulness. Now let us journey together to ancient Israel, to a time when kingdoms stood at crossroads, when truth was a dangerous commodity, and when one man's courage would echo through the ages. This is the story of Micaiah, the forgotten prophet who dared to stand alone. The sun blazed mercilessly over the ancient city of Samaria, its golden rays dancing across the limestone walls of King Ahab's palace. Within those walls, power brooked no opposition, and truth was often the first casualty of political ambition. It had been 3 years since the last war between Israel and Syria, 3 years of uneasy peace that sat heavy on King Ahab's shoulders like an ill-fitting crown. Ahab paced the marble floors of his throne room, his royal robes rustling with each agitated step. The king of Israel was a man consumed by his desires, a ruler who had long ago traded his soul to the altar of self-interest. His marriage to the foreign princess Jezebel had brought prosperity to his kingdom, but at a cost that would echo through generations. The worship of Baal had infiltrated the very heart of Israel, and the prophets of the Lord had been hunted, killed, or driven into hiding. Yet today something stirred within Ahab's ambitious heart. News had arrived that morning of Syrian movements near Ramoth-Gilead, a strategic city that had once belonged to Israel, but now languished under enemy control. The city's location made it a prize worth fighting for, a gateway that could secure trade routes and strengthen his kingdom's eastern border. As Ahab contemplated this opportunity, word came that King Jehoshaphat of Judah was approaching Samaria with a considerable entourage. Jehoshaphat was everything Ahab was not. A king who sought the Lord's face, who had torn down the high places of idol worship, and who ruled with righteousness as his compass. The irony was not lost on Ahab that he would need the help of such a man to achieve his ambitions. The great doors of the throne room swung open with a resonant boom, and Jehoshaphat entered with the dignity befitting a king of David's lineage. He was a man of medium stature but commanding presence, his beard meticulously groomed, and his eyes holding the wisdom of one who had walked closely with the Almighty. Behind him came his advisors and military commanders, their expressions respectful but cautious, as they entered the domain of Israel's controversial king. "Jehoshaphat, my brother," Ahab called out, his voice echoing through the vast chamber as he descended from his throne. "Welcome to Samaria. Your presence brings honour to my house." The two kings embraced in the customary greeting, though those who knew them well could sense the underlying tension. Jehoshaphat had come seeking alliance, but his heart was troubled by what such an alliance might require of him. "Ahab," Jehoshaphat replied warmly, though his eyes remained watchful. "It has been too long since we have spoken face to face. The Lord has blessed both our kingdoms with peace these past years." "Indeed," Ahab agreed, gesturing toward the laden tables his servants had prepared. "Come, let us feast together and speak of matters that concern us both." The banquet that followed was a spectacle of royal excess. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, exotic fruits, and wine from the finest vineyards. Musicians played softly in the background, while servants moved like shadows, attending to every need. Yet beneath the veneer of celebration, both kings harboured their own purposes. As the evening wore on and the wine loosened tongues, Ahab finally revealed his true intention. Leaning toward Jehoshaphat with the conspiratorial air of old friends, he spoke in measured tones. "My brother, there is a matter that weighs heavily upon my heart," Ahab began, his eyes glinting in the torchlight. "You know that Ramoth-Gilead belongs to us, yet it remains in the hands of the king of Syria. Should we not take back what is rightfully ours?" Jehoshaphat set down his goblet carefully, his expression growing thoughtful. He had anticipated this moment, knowing that Ahab rarely extended hospitality without purpose. The question hung in the air between them like incense heavy with implication. Ramoth-Gilead has indeed been a source of contention, Jehoshaphat replied diplomatically. What do you propose? Ahab's smile was that of a merchant who senses a favourable negotiation. I propose that we go up together against Ramoth-Gilead. Your army combined with mine would be formidable. We could restore the city to Israel and share in the glory of victory. The words were carefully chosen, appealing to both practical strategy and Jehoshaphat's sense of brotherhood among the tribes of Israel. Yet Jehoshaphat had not survived as king by making hasty decisions. His reign had been marked by careful consultation with the Lord, and he would not abandon that practice now. I am as you are, Jehoshaphat responded slowly. My people as your people, my horses as your horses. If the Lord wills it, we shall stand together in battle. He paused, his next words carrying the weight of true conviction. But first let us inquire of the Lord. Ahab's smile faltered slightly. In his eagerness for military glory, he had hoped to avoid the complications that divine consultation might bring. Yet he could hardly refuse such a reasonable request from a potential ally, especially one whose righteousness was renowned throughout the region. Of course, Ahab agreed, though his tone lacked enthusiasm. Let us seek the word of the Lord. What followed was a demonstration of the spiritual corruption that had infected Ahab's court. The king summoned his prophets, all 400 of them, men who wore the garments of holiness, but whose hearts served earthly masters. They came in a great procession, their robes flowing and their voices raised in what appeared to be spiritual fervour. These were not true prophets of the Lord, though they claimed his name. They were court prophets, men who understood that their continued prosperity depended upon telling the king what he wished to hear. Their prophecies were crafted not in the secret place of prayer, but in the calculating chambers of political expediency. As the prophets assembled in the courtyard before the two kings, their spokesman stepped forward. His name was Zedekiah, son of Chenaanah, a man whose pride matched his ambition, and whose hatred for true prophets would soon be revealed in violent fashion. Hear the word of the Lord, Zedekiah proclaimed, his voice carrying across the courtyard with theatrical intensity. Go up to Ramoth-Gilead and prosper, for the Lord will deliver it into the hand of the king. The 400 prophets took up the cry with orchestrated precision, their voices creating a chorus of false assurance. Go up to Ramoth-Gilead and prosper. The Lord will deliver it into the hand of the king. Some of the prophets had even prepared visual aids for their performance. They danced and shouted, waving swords and spears, creating a spectacle that would have been impressive to any observer unfamiliar with the ways of true prophecy. The din was tremendous, the enthusiasm seemingly genuine, and the message exactly what Ahab longed to hear. Yet as Jehoshaphat watched this display, his spirit grew troubled. Something about the performance felt hollow, manufactured. These men spoke with one voice, but it was not the voice of the Lord that Jehoshaphat knew from his own times of prayer and seeking. There was no cost to their prophecy, no challenge to the king's desires, no hint of the divine complexity that marked true encounters with the Almighty. As the prophets continued their enthusiastic proclamations, Jehoshaphat raised his hand for silence. The courtyard gradually quieted, though the echo of their shouts seemed to linger in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Is there not here a prophet of the Lord besides these, Jehoshaphat asked carefully, that we might inquire of him? The question fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of discomfort through the assembly. Ahab's face darkened, and several of the court prophets exchanged meaningful glances. They all knew there was indeed another prophet, one whose very existence was a thorn in the flesh of everyone present. Ahab's response came through gritted teeth, his voice barely concealing his irritation. There is still one man, Micaiah the son of Imlah, by whom we may inquire of the Lord, but I hate him, for he does not prophesy good concerning me, but evil. The honesty of Ahab's admission was startling in its nakedness. Here was a king openly declaring his hatred for a prophet based not on any moral failing or false prophecy, but simply because the man refused to tell him what he wanted to hear. It was a moment that revealed the true spiritual state of Israel's leadership. Jehoshaphat, ever the diplomat, sought to smooth over the awkward moment. "Let not the king say such things," he replied gently, though his words carried a subtle rebuke. Ahab realized he had revealed too much of his heart. With visible effort he composed himself and called for one of his officers. "Bring Micaiah the son of Imlah quickly," he commanded, though his tone suggested he would rather summon a plague upon his house. As the officer hurried away on his grim errand, the two kings settled in to wait. The 400 prophets remained in the courtyard, their earlier enthusiasm now tempered by the knowledge that their unanimous voice was about to be challenged by a single man they both feared and despised. The sun continued its relentless journey across the sky, and in the distance the sound of the officer's horse could be heard galloping toward the place where truth dwelt in isolation, where a forgotten prophet waited in the shadows of his integrity. The horse's hooves struck the dusty road with rhythmic precision as the king's officer rode toward the humble dwelling where Micaiah made his home. The prophet lived simply, far from the luxury of the royal court, in a stone house that spoke of function rather than ostentation. Here, away from the corrupting influence of political power, dwelt a man who had chosen faithfulness over favour, truth over comfort. Micaiah son of Imlah was not an imposing figure by earthly standards. Of average height and lean build, he bore the weathered appearance of one who had walked through many storms. His beard was streaked with silver, and his eyes held the deep weariness of a man who had spoken unpopular truths for too many years. Yet there was something unbreakable in his demeanour, a quality that suggested he had found his anchor in something far stronger than human approval. When the king's messenger arrived, Micaiah was in his garden, tending to the vegetables that provided much of his sustenance. The prophet lived modestly, supported by the occasional gifts of those few souls who still valued truth above comfort. He had long ago learned to find contentment in simple things, the satisfaction of honest work, the peace of prayer, and the quiet joy of communion with the Almighty. "Micaiah," the officer called out as he dismounted, "the king commands your presence immediately." The prophet looked up from his work, unsurprised. He had sensed in recent days that the Lord was preparing him for something significant. His prayers had been marked by an unusual intensity, and his dreams had been filled with visions he did not yet fully understand. "Very well," Micaiah replied simply, setting aside his tools. "Let me wash and prepare myself." As Micaiah went about the task of making himself presentable for the royal court, the officer felt compelled to share information that might save the prophet from making a costly mistake. The man had witnessed what happened to those who crossed King Ahab, and despite his loyalty to the crown, he possessed enough humanity to feel concern for this solitary figure. "Listen to me, Micaiah," the officer said, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "The words of the prophets declare good to the king with one mouth. Let your word be like the word of one of them, and speak favourably." It was well-intentioned advice, offered by a man who understood the political realities of Ahab's court. The officer had seen the 400 prophets deliver their unanimous message of victory and prosperity. He knew that Micaiah's reputation for speaking uncomfortable truths could lead to imprisonment, exile, or worse. In his mind, he was offering the prophet a lifeline, a chance to align himself with the majority and avoid the consequences of standing alone. Micaiah paused in his preparations, considering the messenger's words. The offer was clear: conform, agree with the crowd, tell the king what he wants to hear, and enjoy the benefits of royal favour. It would be so easy, so practical, so utterly reasonable by every human measure. But as Micaiah looked into the officer's earnest face, he felt the familiar stirring of the spirit within him, that unmistakable presence that had guided him through decades of faithful service. The Lord had not called him to an easy path, but he had never failed to provide strength for the journey. "As the Lord lives," Micaiah replied with quiet dignity, "whatever the Lord says to me, that I will speak." The words hung in the air between them, a declaration of absolute commitment that left no room for compromise. The officer's face showed his disappointment and concern, but he knew better than to argue further. He had delivered his warning. What the prophet did with it was beyond his control. The journey back to Samaria was made in relative silence, the officer pondering the stubborn integrity of his passenger, while Micaiah prayed and prepared his heart for whatever lay ahead. As they approached the city, the prophet could see the banners of both Israel and Judah flying from the palace walls, confirming his suspicion that this summons involved more than a routine consultation. The palace courtyard was a scene of controlled chaos when they arrived. Servants scurried about preparing for what appeared to be an important gathering, while guards stood at attention in their finest armour. The 400 prophets were still present, clustered in small groups and speaking in hushed tones. Their earlier enthusiasm had given way to a more subdued attitude, though their confidence in their message remained unshaken. As Micaiah dismounted and followed the officer toward the throne room, he could feel the weight of many eyes upon him. Some looks were curious, others hostile, and a few held the barely concealed contempt of those who viewed his independence as a personal affront. He had grown accustomed to such reactions over the years, understanding that his very presence served as an uncomfortable reminder of the spiritual compromise that permeated the court. The great doors opened before them, revealing the opulent throne room where Kings Ahab and Jehoshaphat waited. The contrast between the two rulers was immediately apparent even to a casual observer. Ahab sat upon his throne with the restless energy of a man driven by ambition, his fingers drumming impatiently on the armrest. Jehoshaphat, seated in a chair of equal honour nearby, maintained the composed dignity of one accustomed to seeking divine guidance before making important decisions. "Ah, Micaiah," Ahab said as the prophet entered, his tone carrying forced joviality that fooled no one. "At last, our final consultant arrives." Micaiah approached the throne with measured steps, neither hurrying to show deference nor dawdling to display defiance. He had learned long ago that in the presence of earthly power, his allegiance belonged to a higher authority. When he reached the appropriate distance, he bowed respectfully but not obsequiously, acknowledging the king's position without compromising his own integrity. "You summoned me, your majesty," Micaiah said simply, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. King Jehoshaphat studied the prophet with interest. He had heard reports of Micaiah's reputation for uncompromising honesty, and after witnessing the theatrical performance of the 400 prophets, he was eager to hear from someone who might offer a different perspective. Ahab leaned forward on his throne, his eyes fixed on the solitary figure before him. "Micaiah, shall we go to war against Ramoth-Gilead, or shall we refrain?" It was the same question that had been posed to the 400 prophets, the same inquiry that had produced such enthusiastic unanimity. Now it fell upon the shoulders of one man who stood alone, without allies or supporters, facing the combined expectation of two kings and their assembled courts. The moment stretched taut with anticipation. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something significant, though few could have predicted the drama that was about to unfold. In the silence, Micaiah felt the familiar stirring of the spirit, but what came first was not the word of the Lord, but something altogether unexpected. What happened next would be remembered and debated for generations to come. Micaiah, the prophet known for his uncompromising honesty, looked directly at King Ahab and delivered exactly the message the king wanted to hear. "Go up and prosper," Micaiah declared, his voice carrying throughout the throne room, "for the Lord will deliver it into the hand of the king." A murmur of surprise rippled through the assembled court. The 400 prophets exchanged glances of confusion and perhaps a touch of irritation. Here was the man they had feared would contradict their unanimous verdict, and instead he was confirming their prophecy word for word. Some of them smiled with what they imagined was vindication, while others seemed puzzled by this unexpected development. But King Ahab was no fool. Despite his many moral failings, he had known Micaiah for years, had heard his prophecies of judgment and warning countless times. Never once had the prophet told him what he wanted to hear. Never once had Micaiah's words aligned so perfectly with royal desires. The king's eyes narrowed as he studied the prophet's face, searching for the truth behind this suspicious compliance. There was something in Micaiah's tone, a subtle quality that suggested layers beneath the surface of his words. It was the same tone a parent might use when agreeing with a child's obviously foolish plan, allowing them to proceed while knowing full well what the consequences would be. King Jehoshaphat, too, sensed that something was amiss. though he remained silent, observing the interaction with keen interest. "How many times shall I make you swear," Ahab said slowly, his voice carrying a warning, "that you tell me nothing but the truth in the name of the Lord?" It was a remarkable moment. Here was a king who had just received exactly the prophecy he desired, yet his own conscience convicted him that it could not be genuine. Ahab understood Micaiah well enough to know that such easy agreement was completely out of character. In demanding the truth, the king was inadvertently acknowledging that he recognized the difference between authentic prophecy and the comfortable lies he typically preferred. Micaiah stood silent for a moment, and those watching could see a visible change come over him. The sardonic expression faded from his face, replaced by the solemn countenance of one who was about to deliver a message from the throne room of heaven. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality altogether, the unmistakable authority of divine revelation. "I saw all Israel scattered on the hills like sheep that have no shepherd," Micaiah began, his words falling like stones into the sudden silence. "And the Lord said, 'These have no master. Let each return to his house in peace.'" The impact of these words was immediate and devastating. The vision was clear to everyone present. Israel would be defeated, their army scattered, and their king would not return from battle. It was a prophecy of military disaster and royal death, delivered with the calm certainty of one who had seen beyond the veil of earthly circumstances. King Ahab's face flushed with anger, but beneath the rage was something that looked remarkably like fear. He turned to Jehoshaphat with the bitter satisfaction of one whose worst expectations have been confirmed. "Did I not tell you," Ahab said, his voice heavy with frustration, "that he would not prophesy good concerning me, but evil?" But Micaiah was not finished. The Spirit of the Lord had opened his eyes to see into the very council chambers of heaven, and what he had witnessed there needed to be shared, regardless of the consequences. The prophet's voice took on an even more solemn tone as he continued. "Therefore hear the word of the Lord," Micaiah declared, his words cutting through the tension in the room like a sword. "I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing by, on his right hand and on his left." The court fell absolutely silent. Even the most worldly and cynical among them recognized that they were hearing something extraordinary. This was not the political maneuvering they were accustomed to, nor the comfortable reassurances of the court prophets. This was a glimpse into eternal realities, a revelation of divine purpose that transcended human understanding. "And the Lord said," Micaiah continued, "Who will persuade Ahab to go up, that he may fall at Ramoth-Gilead?" So one spoke in this manner, and another spoke in that manner. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord and said, "I will persuade him." The Lord said to him, "In what way?" And he said, "I will go out and be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets." And the Lord said, "You shall persuade him and also prevail. Go out and do so." The revelation was staggering in its implications. Micaiah was claiming that the Lord himself had allowed, indeed, had orchestrated, the deception that had been proclaimed by the 400 prophets. It was a divine judgment in the form of false prophecy, a spiritual trap set for a king who had repeatedly chosen lies over truth. Therefore, Micaiah concluded with inexorable logic, "Look, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these prophets of yours, and the Lord has declared disaster concerning you." The silence that followed was deafening. Every person present was forced to grapple with the implications of what they had heard. The 400 prophets found themselves accused not merely of error, but of being unwitting instruments of divine deception. The kings faced the terrifying possibility that their carefully planned military campaign was actually a trap set by the Almighty himself. But the silence was short-lived. Zedekiah, the spokesman for the 400 prophets, was a man of considerable pride and ambition. He had built his reputation on his supposed connection to the divine, and Micaiah's words threatened not only his credibility but his entire worldview. The accusation that he had been deceived by a lying spirit was more than he could bear. With a roar of rage, Zedekiah strode across the throne room until he stood face to face with Micaiah. The contrast between them was striking. Zedekiah in his fine robes and carefully groomed appearance, representing the comfortable religiosity of the court, facing Micaiah in his simple garments, embodying the uncompromising voice of authentic prophecy. "Which way did the Spirit from the Lord go from me to speak to you?" Zedekiah demanded, his voice shaking with fury. It was a desperate attempt to challenge Micaiah's authority, to suggest that if anyone possessed a connection to the divine, it was surely the spokesman for 400 prophets rather than this isolated troublemaker. But before Micaiah could respond, Zedekiah's anger overwhelmed his judgment entirely. The sound of the slap echoed through the throne room like a thunderclap. Zedekiah had struck Micaiah across the face with sufficient force to stagger the prophet, leaving a red mark on his cheek that would serve as a visible reminder of what it cost to speak truth in the face of comfortable lies. The act of violence hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. No one moved or spoke, shocked by the sudden transition from theological debate to physical assault. Micaiah slowly straightened, touching his cheek where Zedekiah's hand had left its mark. When he looked up, there was no anger in his eyes, no desire for retaliation. Instead, there was a sadness that seemed to encompass not only his immediate situation, but the entire spiritual state of the nation. "Indeed," Micaiah said quietly, his voice carrying despite its gentle tone, "you shall see on that day when you go into an inner chamber to hide." It was both prophecy and promise. The day would come when Zedekiah's false confidence would crumble, when the reality of divine judgment would force him to seek shelter from the consequences of his deception. The words carried the weight of inevitable fulfillment, spoken not in anger, but with the sorrowful certainty of one who had seen the future and found it tragic. King Ahab had heard enough. The prophet's words had struck too close to uncomfortable truths, had challenged too directly the comfortable illusions upon which he had built his reign. The vision of divine deception, the prophecy of military disaster, the humiliating suggestion that his 400 prophets were unwitting instruments of judgment, all of it combined to create a rage that demanded immediate action. "Take Micaiah," the king commanded, his voice sharp with fury, "and return him to Ammon, the governor of the city, and to Joash the king's son, and say, 'Thus says the king, put this fellow in prison, and feed him with bread of affliction and water of affliction until I come in peace.'" The order was both punishment and insurance policy. By imprisoning Micaiah until his safe return from battle, Ahab was attempting to nullify the prophecy through royal decree. It was a desperate act of defiance against divine judgment, a futile attempt to bind the word of the Lord with chains and prison walls. But Micaiah was not finished. Even as the guards moved toward him, even as the shadow of imprisonment fell across his path, the prophet had one final word to speak. His voice rang out across the throne room with the clarity of absolute conviction. "If you ever return in peace, the Lord has not spoken by me." The words were a direct challenge to royal authority, a public declaration that put Micaiah's credibility as a prophet on the line. He was essentially saying that if Ahab returned safely from battle, then everyone present should conclude that Micaiah was a false prophet deserving of death. It was the ultimate expression of confidence in the word he had received from the Lord. But Micaiah was not content to let his challenge rest with the immediate audience. Looking around the throne room at the assembled courtiers, nobles and servants, he raised his voice even louder. "Mark it, all you people." It was a call to witness, an appeal to everyone present to remember this moment and test the validity of his prophecy against future events. The prophet was willing to stake everything, his reputation, his freedom, possibly his life, on the truth of what he had spoken. It was a level of certainty that transcended human confidence and entered the realm of divine assurance. As the guards seized Micaiah's arms and began to lead him away, the throne room erupted in a buzz of conversation. Some whispered among themselves about the prophet's boldness, others debated the implications of his vision, and still others tried to process the dramatic confrontation they had just witnessed. Through it all, the 400 prophets maintained their uncomfortable silence, uncertain how to respond to accusations that struck at the very heart of their prophetic claims. King Jehoshaphat watched the proceedings with deep concern. The righteous king of Judah had requested divine counsel, and what he had received was a prophecy that directly contradicted his military plans and predicted disaster for his ally. Yet something in Micaiah's bearing, some quality of authentic conviction, made it impossible to dismiss his words as the ravings of a madman or the spite of a disgruntled prophet. As Micaiah was led away, his footsteps echoing through the palace corridors, he felt no bitterness toward his captors or self-pity for his situation. He had spoken the word of the Lord faithfully, regardless of the consequences, and that obedience brought a peace that transcended his circumstances. The prison cell that awaited him might confine his body, but his spirit remained free, anchored in the unshakable certainty that he had been faithful to his calling. The cell where Micaiah was imprisoned was a far cry from the luxury of the royal court. Built of rough stone with a small barred window that provided minimal light, it was designed for punishment rather than comfort. The bread of affliction and water of affliction promised by the king proved to be exactly that, meagre rations calculated to sustain life while providing a constant reminder of a royal displeasure. Yet in that dark cell, Micaiah found something that had eluded him in the freedom of his simple home, absolute clarity about his purpose and calling. Stripped of all earthly comforts and securities, he was forced to rely entirely upon his relationship with the Lord. In the long hours of solitude, he prayed not for deliverance but for continued faithfulness, not for vindication, but for grace to endure whatever lay ahead. Meanwhile, preparations for war continued with increasing intensity. King Ahab threw himself into military planning with the fervour of a man trying to drown out unwelcome voices of conscience. He consulted with his generals, inspected his troops, and made elaborate arrangements for what he was determined would be a glorious victory. The prophecy of the 400 court prophets was repeated frequently, as if constant repetition could somehow make it more reliable. King Jehoshaphat, however, found himself deeply troubled by the day's events. The contrast between the theatrical unanimity of the 400 prophets and Micaiah's stark authenticity had left him with serious doubts about the wisdom of the planned campaign. Yet he had given his word to stand with Ahab, and the political implications of backing out now were significant. As the day of departure approached, Ahab made one final attempt to circumvent the prophecy that haunted his thoughts. If the word of the Lord through Micaiah was true, then King Ahab was destined to die in battle. But perhaps, the king reasoned, he could outwit divine judgment through human cleverness. "I will disguise myself and go into battle," Ahab announced to his commanders, "but you put on your robes." It was a cunning plan. By dressing as an ordinary soldier while Jehoshaphat wore royal garments, Ahab hoped to deceive the enemy about his identity and location. If the Syrians could not identify him as the king of Israel, perhaps he could survive the battle and prove Micaiah wrong. It was the kind of tactical thinking that had served Ahab well in political manoeuvring, but he was about to discover that divine judgment operates by different rules than human conflict. The morning of battle dawned clear and bright, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers across the plains surrounding Ramoth Gilead. It seemed an unlikely day for the fulfillment of prophecy, too beautiful for the tragic events that were about to unfold. The armies of Israel and Judah had assembled in impressive formation, their banners flying proudly in the morning air, their weapons gleaming in the sunlight. King Ahab, disguised as a common soldier, moved among his troops with nervous energy. His royal armour had been replaced with the simple leather and bronze of an ordinary warrior, and his distinctive crown was nowhere to be seen. To any casual observer, he appeared to be merely another commander preparing for battle, yet those closest to him could sense his underlying anxiety, the tension of a man who was trying to outrun a divine decree. King Jehoshaphat, meanwhile, wore his royal robes with obvious reluctance. The righteous king of Judah had agreed to this deception as part of their military strategy, but his conscience troubled him. The memory of Micaiah's words weighed heavily on his mind, and he found himself offering frequent prayers for divine protection and guidance. The Syrian army was formidable, well-trained and confident in their ability to defend their territory. Their king had given specific instructions to his 32 chariot commanders: fight with no one small or great, but only with the king of Israel. It was a strategic decision based on the understanding that killing or capturing the enemy king would effectively end the battle and secure victory. As the two armies faced each other across the field of battle, the air was thick with tension and anticipation. Horses stamped impatiently, armour creaked as soldiers shifted their weight, and commanders made final adjustments to their battle plans. In the distance, the walls of Ramoth-Gilead stood as silent witness to the conflict that was about to determine its fate. The battle began with the thunderous clash of armies colliding, the sound of metal against metal mixing with the shouts of warriors and the screams of the wounded. Chariots raced across the battlefield like instruments of divine wrath, their wheels churning up clouds of dust that obscured vision and added to the chaos of combat. For a time, it seemed as though Ahab's strategy might succeed. Hidden among his soldiers, the disguised king fought with the desperation of a man who believed his life depended on remaining unrecognized. His years of military experience served him well as he wielded sword and spear with deadly efficiency, contributing to the initial success of the Israelite forces. But the Syrian chariot commanders were not easily deceived. When they spotted King Jehoshaphat in his royal robes, they immediately assumed they had found their primary target. A group of them converged on the king of Judah with deadly intent, their chariots cutting through the battle lines like ships through stormy seas. "Surely it is the king of Israel," they shouted to one another as they closed in on Jehoshaphat. The king of Judah found himself surrounded by enemy chariots, their occupants preparing to capture or kill what they believed to be their primary objective. In that moment of extreme danger, Jehoshaphat did what he had learned to do throughout his reign. He cried out to the Lord for deliverance. "Help me, O Lord," Jehoshaphat called out, his voice carrying above the din of battle. What happened next was a clear demonstration of divine intervention. As Jehoshaphat's cry reached heaven, the Lord moved the hearts of the Syrian commanders in an unexpected way. Something about the king's appearance or manner suddenly convinced them that this was not their intended target after all. "It is not the king of Israel," one of them declared, and just as quickly as they had converged upon Jehoshaphat, they turned away to search for their real quarry elsewhere on the battlefield. Meanwhile, across the chaos of combat, King Ahab continued his desperate masquerade. His disguise had served him well throughout the morning, allowing him to participate in the battle without attracting the special attention of enemy forces. For a brief moment, it seemed as though human cunning might indeed triumph over divine decree. But the Lord's purposes are not thwarted by earthly schemes, no matter how cleverly conceived. As the battle raged on, a Syrian soldier drew his bow at random, not aiming at any particular target, but simply shooting into the mass of enemy forces. It was the kind of arrow that soldiers loose when they cannot see clearly, through the dust and confusion of battle, hoping to strike something useful, but with no specific intent. The arrow flew through the air with the invisible guidance of divine providence. It passed over the heads of common soldiers, sailed between the wheels of racing chariots, and found its mark with the precision of perfect justice. The bronze point struck King Ahab between the joints of his armour, penetrating the one gap in his defences that his disguise could not protect. The king felt the arrow's impact like a thunderbolt, the sudden sharp pain followed by the warm spread of blood across his chest. He looked down in shock to see the Syrian arrow protruding from his body, its shaft trembling with the force of impact. In that instant, Ahab understood with perfect clarity that no amount of human cleverness could circumvent the word of the Lord. "I am wounded," the king cried out to his chariot driver, his voice tight with pain and the dawning realization of his doom. "Turn around and carry me out of the battle." The chariot driver, a loyal servant who had recognized his disguised king despite the common soldier's garb, immediately began maneuvering toward the edge of the battlefield. But extricating themselves from the chaos of combat proved more difficult than anticipated. The battle had intensified throughout the day, and enemy forces blocked many of the potential escape routes. As they struggled to retreat, King Ahab's condition continued to deteriorate. The arrow had found a vital spot and blood flowed freely from the wound despite his attempts to stanch it. Yet with grim determination, the king remained propped up in his chariot, unwilling to let his army see him fall. His presence, even in his wounded state, served to encourage the Israelite forces and maintain their fighting spirit. The battle raged from morning until evening. the outcome hanging in the balance as both sides fought with desperate intensity. But as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of red that seemed to mirror the blood spilled on the battlefield below, King Ahab's strength finally gave out. The disguised king who had tried to outwit divine judgment slumped forward in his chariot, his life ebbing away with each laboured breath. As word of the king's condition spread through the ranks, the cry went up that would fulfill Micaiah's prophecy with devastating accuracy. Every man to his city, and every man to his own country. The army of Israel, leaderless and demoralised, began to scatter across the hills just as the prophet had foreseen. Like sheep without a shepherd, they abandoned their positions and fled toward home, their dreams of victory dissolving into the nightmare of defeat. King Ahab died as the sun set over Ramoth-Gilead, his blood pooling in the bottom of his chariot. The man who had spent his reign choosing comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths had finally encountered a reality that no amount of deception could alter. The word of the Lord, spoken through his faithful prophet, had been fulfilled to the letter. News of King Ahab's death spread quickly through the land, carried by the scattered remnants of his army and the merchants who followed military campaigns. In the palace at Samaria, the reaction was one of stunned disbelief. The 400 prophets who had proclaimed certain victory found themselves facing a crisis of credibility that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In his prison cell, Micaiah heard the news with a mixture of sadness and vindication. He had taken no pleasure in prophesying disaster, had felt no joy in predicting the death of his king. Yet the fulfillment of his prophecy served as a powerful reminder that the word of the Lord does not return void, regardless of how unwelcome it might be to human ears. When the guards came to release him from prison, Micaiah emerged into the daylight a changed man. His body bore the marks of his confinement. He was thinner, paler, and bore the lines of one who had endured hardship. But his spirit was unbroken, perhaps even strengthened by his ordeal. He had spoken truth in the face of overwhelming opposition, had maintained his integrity under pressure, and had been vindicated by the very events that had brought tragedy to the kingdom. The political ramifications of Ahab's death were immediate and far-reaching. His son Ahaziah ascended to the throne, inheriting a kingdom shaken by military defeat and spiritual confusion. The influence of Queen Jezebel remained strong, but the dramatic fulfillment of Micaiah's prophecy had dealt a severe blow to the credibility of the Baal-worshipping establishment. Zedekiah, the false prophet who had struck Micaiah in the throne room, found himself in an impossible position. His confident predictions of victory had been thoroughly discredited, and his authority as a spokesman for the divine had been shattered. The inner chamber where he sought to hide, just as Micaiah had prophesied, became both a physical and spiritual reality as he struggled to come to terms with the magnitude of his error. The other court prophets faced similar crises of confidence. Their unanimous declaration of victory had been revealed as the lying spirit Micaiah had warned about, and their reputations lay in ruins. Some of them quietly retired from public life, while others attempted to reinvent themselves as followers of different deities. None of them could escape the uncomfortable truth that they had been deceived, and had, in turn, deceived others. King Jehoshaphat returned to Jerusalem a wiser and more cautious man. His alliance with Ahab had nearly cost him his life, and the experience had taught him valuable lessons about the importance of seeking genuine divine guidance rather than accepting comfortable confirmations of predetermined plans. The prophet Jehu, son of Hanani, met him upon his return with words of rebuke for his alliance with the ungodly king, but also with recognition that the Lord had delivered him from the consequences of his poor judgment. Throughout the kingdom, people began to reassess their understanding of prophecy and divine revelation. The dramatic contrast between the false assurances of the 400 prophets and the accurate warnings of the solitary Micaiah had provided a vivid lesson in discernment. Many began to understand that true prophecy was not measured by its popularity or its agreement with human desires, but by its faithfulness to the word and character of the Lord. Years passed, and the story of Micaiah's stand against the 400 false prophets became one of the most remembered episodes in the history of Israel. Parents told it to their children as an example of courage and integrity. while religious teachers used it to illustrate the difference between true and false prophecy. The tale grew in significance with each telling, not because it was embellished, but because its lessons proved to be timeless and universal. The first and most obvious lesson was about the cost of speaking truth. Micaiah had paid a heavy price for his faithfulness: imprisonment, isolation, and the hostility of the powerful. Yet his willingness to endure these hardships had ultimately served a greater purpose, preserving the integrity of prophetic ministry and providing a clear example of what it meant to fear God rather than man. His story became a source of encouragement for future generations of prophets and faithful believers who found themselves standing alone against popular opinion. The second lesson concerned the danger of groupthink and manufactured consensus. The 400 prophets had created an impressive display of unanimity, but their agreement had been based on political expediency rather than divine revelation. Their story served as a warning about the seductive power of majority opinion and the importance of seeking truth, even when it contradicted popular sentiment. The comfort of belonging to the crowd, they learned, was no substitute for the sometimes lonely path of authentic faith. The third lesson was perhaps the most theologically complex: the reality that God sometimes allows deception as a form of judgment. The lying spirit that had influenced the false prophets was not an independent force, but an instrument of divine justice, permitted by the Lord as part of his sovereign plan. This aspect of the story forced believers to grapple with difficult questions about the nature of divine sovereignty and human responsibility, helping them develop a more mature understanding of how God works in the world. The fourth lesson focused on the importance of discernment in spiritual matters. King Jehoshaphat's initial uneasiness with the 400 prophets had been a manifestation of spiritual discernment, a recognition that something was amiss despite the impressive display of consensus. His request for a prophet of the Lord had demonstrated the value of seeking authentic divine guidance rather than accepting convenient confirmations of predetermined plans. The fifth lesson was about the ultimate futility of human schemes when they oppose divine purposes. King Ahab's elaborate disguise had been a clever attempt to circumvent prophecy through human ingenuity, but it had proven utterly useless against the sovereign will of the Lord. The random arrow that found its mark had served as a powerful reminder that God's purposes will be accomplished regardless of human attempts to thwart them. As the years passed and the kingdom of Israel continued its spiritual decline, the story of Micaiah took on additional significance. It became a benchmark against which other prophets and prophecies were measured, a reminder of what authentic faithfulness looked like in the face of opposition. When Elijah stood alone against the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, people remembered Micaiah's solitary stand. When Jeremiah faced persecution for his unpopular messages, the example of Micaiah's courage provided encouragement and precedent. The story also served as a cautionary tale for those in positions of authority. King Ahab's admission that he hated Micaiah because the prophet never spoke favourably about him had revealed the dangerous tendency of leaders to surround themselves with yes men rather than truthful counsellors. Future kings and officials who heard the story were challenged to examine their own relationships with advisors and to consider whether they were seeking truth or merely confirmation of their existing beliefs. In the quiet of his later years, Micaiah often reflected on that pivotal day when he had stood alone before 2 kings and 400 false prophets. The physical scars from his imprisonment had faded, but the spiritual impact of his experience continued to shape his understanding of his calling and his relationship with the Lord. The prophet had learned that faithfulness was not measured by immediate results, but by obedience to divine instruction. His warning had not prevented the battle or saved King Ahab's life, but it had preserved the integrity of prophetic ministry and provided a clear demonstration of the difference between true and false revelation. Sometimes, he realized, the greatest victories were won not through changing circumstances, but through maintaining faithfulness in the midst of difficult circumstances. Micaiah had also discovered that standing alone was not the same as being alone. In his prison cell, deprived of human companionship and comfort, he had experienced a deeper intimacy with the Lord than he had ever known before. The isolation that had seemed like punishment had actually become a pathway to greater spiritual understanding and strength. He had learned that the approval of the crowd was a poor substitute for the approval of the Almighty. The prophet had come to understand that his role was not to be popular, but to be faithful, not to tell people what they wanted to hear, but to speak what the Lord had given him to say. This understanding had freed him from the burden of trying to manage people's reactions to his messages, and had allowed him to focus entirely on the sacred responsibility of accurate communication of divine truth. The peace that came from this clarity of purpose was worth more than all the royal favour he might have gained through compromise. As news of Micaiah's faithfulness spread beyond the borders of Israel, his story began to influence other nations and cultures. Foreign dignitaries who visited the kingdom often asked to hear the account of the prophet who had stood against 400 false prophets and accurately predicted the death of a king. The story became a testament to the power of truth and the importance of moral courage, inspiring people of various backgrounds to examine their own commitments to integrity and faithfulness. The story also had a profound impact on the understanding of prophecy itself. Future generations would use Micaiah's example as a standard for evaluating prophetic claims, recognizing that true prophecy was characterized by faithfulness to the Lord's character and purposes rather than by popular appeal or immediate gratification. The account helped establish criteria for distinguishing between authentic divine revelation and human manipulation disguised as spiritual authority. In the broader context of Israel's history, Micaiah's stand represented a crucial moment in the preservation of true worship and authentic faith. At a time when the kingdom was sliding towards spiritual apostasy, his unwavering commitment to truth served as a beacon of hope for those who still sought to follow the Lord with integrity. His example encouraged other faithful believers to maintain their convictions even when they seemed to be in the minority. The story of Micaiah also served as a bridge between the ministries of the earlier prophets like Elijah and later ones like Jeremiah and Ezekiel. His experience of standing alone against popular opinion and suffering for his faithfulness would be echoed in the lives of many subsequent prophets who faced similar challenges. The patterns of persecution, vindication, and ultimate triumph that characterized his story became recurring themes in the ongoing narrative of God's relationship with his people. As we reach the end of Micaiah's story, we find ourselves confronted with questions that transcend the ancient world and speak directly to our modern hearts. In an age of social media echo chambers and manufactured consensus, the prophet's example challenges us to examine our own commitment to truth and our willingness to stand alone when necessary. The 400 false prophets of Micaiah's day have their counterparts in every generation. Those who tell us what we want to hear rather than what we need to hear, who offer comfortable lies instead of challenging truths. The temptation to join the crowd, to find safety in numbers, to seek approval rather than accuracy, remains as strong today as it was in ancient Israel. Micaiah's courage reminds us that faithfulness is not a group activity, but an individual responsibility. Each of us must decide whether we will speak truth or remain silent, whether we will stand for what is right or compromise for what is convenient. The prophet's example shows us that the path of integrity is often lonely, but it is never walked alone by those who trust in the Lord. The story also challenges us to examine our own relationship with authority and our tendency to surround ourselves with people who confirm our existing beliefs rather than challenging us to grow. Like King Ahab, we may find ourselves preferring the comfort of familiar lies to the discomfort of unfamiliar truths. Micaiah's example calls us to seek out voices that speak with authenticity, rather than those that merely echo our own opinions. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Micaiah reminds us that truth has a way of prevailing in the end, even when it seems overwhelmed by opposition. The prophet's vindication did not come immediately, and it came at great personal cost, but it came nonetheless. His example encourages us to trust in the ultimate triumph of truth, and to remain faithful even when the outcome is uncertain. In our own lives, we may face moments when we are called to be like Micaiah, to stand alone against popular opinion, to speak uncomfortable truths, to choose faithfulness over favour. When those moments come, May we remember the forgotten prophet who found his courage not in the approval of men, but in the approval of his God. The story of Micaiah teaches us that true strength is not found in numbers, but in conviction, that real courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what is right despite our fears, and that lasting victory comes not from avoiding conflict, but from maintaining integrity in the midst of it. As you close your eyes tonight and drift towards sleep, may you carry with you the quiet courage of Micaiah, the man who dared to stand alone because he knew he was not truly alone. May his example inspire you to speak truth with love, to stand for what is right with humility, and to trust in the ultimate triumph of God's purposes even when the immediate circumstances seem overwhelming. In a world that often rewards conformity and punishes authenticity, may you find the strength to be like Micaiah, faithful, courageous, and true. For in the end, it is not the approval of the crowd that matters, but the approval of the one who sees all hearts and knows all truths. The forgotten prophet's story ends, but its echo continues in every heart that chooses truth over comfort, courage over convenience, and faithfulness over favour. May that echo sound clearly in your own life, guiding you toward the kind of integrity that leaves a lasting legacy long after the voices of the crowd have faded into silence. Rest well, dear friends, and may your dreams be filled with the peace that comes from knowing you serve a God who honours faithfulness, rewards courage, and never abandons those who trust in him. The story of Micaiah reminds us that in God's kingdom, standing alone with truth is always better than standing with the crowd in deception. Sleep peacefully, knowing that, like Micaiah, you're never truly alone when you walk in the light of divine truth.